High Gaius tonight. The world Maria Antonia was born into was not one of gentle nurseries and unconditional love, but one of rigorous routine, polished marble, and the perpetual, chilling awareness of duty. Her cradle, though silk-lined and nestled within the imperial grandeur of Schönbrunn Palace, was fundamentally a strategic position on the largest chessboard in Europe. She was the 15th and final child of Empress Maria Theresa, the formidable matriarch of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, and to be the child of such a woman was to be born less a daughter and more an asset. Vienna in the 1750s, the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, was a city of controlled exuberance. At Schönbrunn, everything, from the position of a fork at dinner to the depth of a curtsy, was a political declaration. Maria Antonia, born on the day of the great Lisbon earthquake, an event superstitiously interpreted as a celestial portent of upheaval, came into a world still reeling from the 7 Years' War. Though the war was over, the scars of humiliation and lost territory, chiefly the loss of Silesia to Prussia's Frederick the Great, still dictated every move Maria Theresa made. This was the empire's game, and the empress understood that victory in the next round would be secured not by cannons, but by carefully placed wedding rings. The Archduchess grew up in a vast, sprawling family, a boisterous, often overwhelming community where the emperor and empress were distant, divine figures. Maria Theresa's affection, when it was given, was earned through compliance, intellect, and, most importantly, utility. Maria Antonia was a charming, lively child with a famously graceful neck and eyes that sparkled with an almost dangerous vivacity. She possessed a natural theatrical flair, a love of music. She once charmed a young Wolfgang Mozart, her near-exact contemporary, who famously proposed marriage to her after she helped him up from a fall, and a disposition that preferred dancing and riding to Latin declensions or history lessons. This preference was a constant, frustrating struggle for her mother. The Empress was mercilessly pragmatic regarding her children's education, viewing it as preparation for their designated roles. She personally supervised the infamous Kaiserzimmer, imperial chamber, a council dedicated solely to the observation and political deployment of her offspring. Letters from the Empress to the young Archduchess were less maternal endearments and more bracing instructions. Your handwriting is dreadful. Your study of the French language is still lamentably weak. You must improve. While her siblings, particularly her sister Maria Carolina, future Queen of Naples, were diligent students, Maria Antonia lagged behind. A new tutor, the Abbé Vermond, was eventually dispatched by Vienna's chief statesman, Prince Kaunitz, to assess the youngest Archduchess's readiness for her inevitable destiny. Vermond's report was chillingly direct. The Archduchess is rather lazy, easily distracted, and not very adept at sustained study. But she has a quick and observant mind, and her grace and charm are unmatched. She is a diamond that requires cutting. That cutting was now a matter of acute urgency, for France, the historic ancestral enemy of the Habsburgs, was poised to become the most critical piece of the empire's defensive strategy. The engine of alliance, the French connection. For centuries, France and Austria had been locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy. But in the 1750s, Maria Theresa and her foreign minister, Kaunitz, engineered the diplomatic revolution, a stunning reversal of alliances that saw Austria forsake her old ally, Great Britain, and embrace the Bourbons of France. This partnership, solidified by shared fears of Prussian expansion, was a geopolitical masterstroke, but it was fragile, held together by the thin thread of diplomatic necessity.
Only a royal marriage, an infusion of Habsburg blood into the Bourbon line, could truly cement the pact. Maria Antonia was not the first archduchess groomed for this role. Her older sister, Johanna Gabriella, was the initially designated bride for the Dauphin, but she succumbed to smallpox in 1762. Then came Maria Josepha, the next in line, a pious and quiet girl who died of the same disease only 4 years later. Death, for the archduchesses, was not just a personal tragedy, but a devastating diplomatic setback. The pressure fell squarely on the next available girl, Maria Antonia. At the age of 11, her purpose was fixed. She was to be the living seal on the Treaty of Franco-Austrian Friendship. The knowledge that her life was predetermined, her body a vessel for statecraft, imparted a unique, if subtle, heartbreak to her childhood. She was taught to speak, to dance, and to smile in a way that would be pleasing to a court she had never seen and a future husband she had never met. Every ribbon, every public appearance, every carefully crafted letter sent to the French ambassador was a meticulous performance for the French foreign minister, the Duc de Choiselier, who was orchestrating the entire arrangement from Paris. In 1769, the final binding negotiations commenced. Choiselier, eager to ensure the Archduchess was perfectly suitable, demanded details on everything: her temperament, her looks, her health. Maria Theresa, in her detailed correspondence, painted a picture of a flawless future queen, carefully glossing over her daughter's intellectual weaknesses. The transaction was purely commercial, conducted not in terms of love or companionship, but in dowries, border agreements, and military pacts. The impending sacrifice. The formal engagement arrived in a wave of pomp that belied the cold calculations beneath it. In January 1770, the official request was received. Maria Antonia, now 14, was suddenly the epicenter of European attention. The news brought a complex storm of emotions: excitement at the thought of being a queen, terror at leaving the only home she had ever known, and a deep-seated resignation to her fate. Maria Theresa, ever the politician, used the remaining months to bombard her daughter with detailed, often harsh instructions. These famous counseling letters were her last great contribution to the empire's game. Remember your duty to the king and the country to which you are now bound. Your first priority must be to win the affection of the entire royal family and the French nation. Be courteous, modest, and serious. Your personal happiness is secondary to your position. There was no talk of personal joy or conjugal affection, only strategy. Her mother was preparing her for a political battleground, not a marriage bed. In April 1770, the time for departure arrived. The preparations for her crossing were symbolic and brutal. Every item, every connection to Austria had to be stripped away. The transfer was set to take place on a small island constructed on the Rhine River, exactly halfway between Strasbourg, French territory, and Kehl, German territory. It was an unnervingly sterile piece of neutral ground, a box of wooden walls and draped tapestries erected only for this transaction. On the Austrian side, a group of ladies-in-waiting, servants, and the great Maria Theresa herself bid farewell to Archduchess Maria Antonia. On the French side, waiting were the appointed French ladies-in-waiting, dressed in the latest Paris fashion, cold and critically appraising. The Empress delivered her final devastating instruction to her daughter as they reached the edge of the island. My daughter, do not forget that you are now French, and only French. Do not let them say that we sent them an Austrian. Maria Antonia was then escorted into the simple wooden hut. Inside, she was publicly and ritually stripped of every garment and trinket she had brought from Vienna. her Austrian-cut dresses, her Austrian shoes, her Austrian jewelry. This was not merely a change of clothes, it was an act of political purification, a physical metaphor for the complete shedding of her national identity. When she emerged, dressed in French silks provided by the Bourbons, she was no longer Maria Antonia, the Habsburg Archduchess. She was Marie Antoinette, the Dauphine of France, a political commodity fully paid for and delivered. She stepped across the threshold, a beautiful, trembling fawn sacrificed to secure a fragile peace, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. The heartbreak of the Archduchess was sealed at the Rhine, forever replaced by the perilous destiny of the Queen. The golden cage of Versailles awaited.
The tearful farewell to Vienna, a girl's journey into the unknown. The magnificent facade of Schönbrunn Palace, usually a symbol of impregnable imperial power, had in the early spring of 1770 become the backdrop for a prolonged, exquisite agony. Maria Antonietta, barely 14 years old, found herself caught in a whirlwind of final preparations that felt less like anticipation for a wedding and more like arrangements for a grand, irreversible exile. The political necessity had been articulated. The transfer of the pawn had been negotiated. Now came the brutal reality of the personal farewell. Her last days in Vienna were a blur of state dinners, ceremonial balls, and tearful partings from the few souls she truly loved. Her personal friends were forbidden from following her. Her pets were left behind. Every object she possessed had been scrutinized, categorized, and either approved for the French court or deemed too Austrian to risk contaminating the delicate new alliance. She was being systematically peeled away from her past. On the final night, Maria Antonietta retreated to her apartments. The rooms, once filled with the happy noise of her younger siblings and the stern but familiar echoes of her mother's presence, felt suddenly vast and cold. She walked past the portrait of her late father, Emperor Francis Stephen, whose memory represented the softer side of the imperial coin, a tenderness often overshadowed by Maria Theresa's iron will. Now, even that faint shadow of comfort was being left behind. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the girl who walked out the palace gates tomorrow would never return. Her future was France. Her past was now locked behind a gilded door she could not reopen. The Empress's final, cruel act of love. The most difficult farewell belonged to her mother, Maria Theresa, the great Empress, who had governed a vast multi-ethnic empire and survived the onslaught of Prussia, could not afford to show weakness. Her final interview with Maria Antoinetta was not a scene of maternal comfort, but a final, relentless lesson in statecraft. The Empress sat erect, her expression a mask of political determination. She presented her daughter with a small private gift, a simple, unadorned gold ring engraved with a quote from Virgil, "Teneme, ne fugam," meaning, "Hold me, lest I flee." It was a cryptic motto that spoke volumes, a desperate plea for her daughter to remember her Austrian roots and the importance of her mission, yet simultaneously a recognition that the girl would instinctively wish to escape the gilded prison awaiting her. But the words that followed were sharp and uncompromising. Maria Theresa laid out the political contract one last time. She reminded Marie Antoinette that her primary role was to secure the alliance. "Your fate is now linked to France," the Empress commanded.
You must be courteous, humble, and above all, fertile. Your value is measured by the stability you bring to the throne and the children you bear. Do not write to me with frivolous gossip. Write to me with substance. Be French, wholly and completely, or you risk the peace of Europe." The words stung, penetrating the young girl's burgeoning confidence. It was a final, painful reaffirmation that she was and always had been a valuable commodity, a strategic pawn whose heart, mind, and comfort were irrelevant compared to the political dividends she must pay. The farewell was tearful, yet the tears were quickly dried by the realization that her mother had delivered her to her destiny, not out of malice, but out of the highest political necessity. This final, cold interaction was the Empress's most cruel act of love, ensuring her daughter was armored for the ordeal ahead. The public spectacle of departure. The morning of April 21, 1770, dawned bright and cold. The streets of Vienna were choked with citizens, all eager to witness the departure of the last Archduchess to be sacrificed on the altar of the Bourbon alliance. The procession was overwhelming in its magnificence. Gilded carriages, drawn by teams of 6 magnificent horses, rolled slowly out of the palace gates. Uniformed guards on horseback, their breastplates gleaming, formed a protective yet isolating barrier around the central coach carrying Maria Antoinette. As she looked out the window, she saw the thousands of weeping faces of the Viennese crowds. They loved her, the charming, vibrant young Archduchess who embodied the spirit of the court. Their tears were genuine, a collective mourning for the loss of their princess, and perhaps a silent apprehension for her difficult future. This public display of affection was almost too much for her to bear. Struggling to maintain the rigid composure her mother demanded, Maria Antoinette pressed her face against the velvet upholstery and finally allowed the torrent of tears to flow. She was not crying for the grandeur she was leaving, but for the anonymity and freedom of heart she would never again possess. The journey began, a slow, ponderous march that would take nearly a month to cover the several hundred miles to the French border on the Rhine. A journey under glass. The route from Vienna to Strasbourg was a carefully curated series of public performances. The convoy moved through the German principalities that comprised the Holy Roman Empire, each stop a mandatory opportunity for local nobility to pay homage to the future Dauphin of France. For Maria Antoinette, the carriage became a gilded prison, a moving stage where she was constantly on display. She was forced to endure endless welcoming ceremonies, banquets, and formal greetings. The journey, which should have been a time of quiet reflection, became an exhausting ritual of being examined. Every detail of her attire, her manners, and her facial expressions was scrutinized, recorded, and reported back to Vienna and Paris. She was being systematically peeled away from her past. She exchanged final, often censored letters with her sister, Maria Carolina, and her favorite brother, Joseph. Their advice, though loving, often reinforced the severity of her mission. Joseph, the future emperor, reminded her, "You must never forget, Antonia, that you are the primary guarantor of the Austro-French peace. You must be tireless in your pursuit of the king's love." Even the love she received was inherently political. As the carriage approached the Rhine River, the river that marked the geopolitical boundary between her past and her future, the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. The French contingent, waiting on the far bank, was becoming palpably closer. The French ladies-in-waiting, already appointed, sent advance correspondence detailing the etiquette she must observe upon meeting them, instructions that were colder and more formal than anything she had known in Vienna. The final striptease of identity. The place of exchange, the island of the Rhine, was infamous in royal protocol. It was a small, desolate patch of land built up in the middle of the river, deliberately stripped of any defining national characteristics. On this neutral soil, the Archduchess would officially cease to be Austrian and become French. Maria Antoinette was led into the hastily constructed wooden pavilion. The structure was divided into 2 rooms by a heavy drape, the Austrian side still decorated with tapestries bearing the double-headed eagle of the empire, the French side decked in the fleur-de-lis. It was here that the final, most devastating act of separation took place. In the first room, surrounded by her beloved Austrian entourage, her governess, Countess von Brandes, and the servants who had watched her grow, Maria Antoinette was publicly and ritually divested of every single item of her Austrian possession. Her Vienna-spun silk gowns were removed, her Austrian-made shoes, her handkerchiefs embroidered with her family crest, even the little prayer book gifted by her mother. It was political purification taken to a literal extreme. She stood briefly, humiliatingly, in a moment of utter vulnerability, a young girl whose identity was being stripped down to her very skin. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the final heartfelt sobs of her Austrian ladies. Countess von Brandes, her maternal anchor throughout her childhood, could not contain her grief. "This is the end, my darling," the Countess whispered, clutching the girl one last time, "the end of happiness." The words echoed in the small chamber, a terrible, unintentional prophecy. She was then handed over to the new French delegation. They were impeccably dressed, aloof and critical. They saw a beautiful girl, but one who was too tall, too pale, and who possessed a certain Viennese looseness they would quickly rectify. They dressed her in the stiff, corseted silks of the French court, taught her the French curtsy that was deeper and more deferential than the Austrian one, and gave her a new name, Marie Antoinette. When the drape separating the rooms was finally pulled back, Maria Antoinette was gone. In her place stood Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. She crossed the final threshold, stepping out of the pavilion and onto the French-controlled side of the island. She was greeted with chilling, formal ceremony by the Comte de Provence, her new brother-in-law. The air was different, the light was different, and the weight on her shoulders was heavier. She had left her home, her mother, and her identity behind in a wooden hut on a river island. She had begun her journey into the unknown, a foreign teenager who carried the entire weight of the Franco-Austrian alliance and a profound, secret loneliness into the heart of her husband's kingdom. Versailles' golden cage, isolation amid 1,000 candles. The journey from the Rhine was a grueling, month-long exercise in pomp and public display. Yet nothing in the quiet, orderly grandeur of Schönbrunn, nor the tiring formality of the road, could have prepared Marie Antoinette for the sheer, dazzling, and oppressive magnificence of Versailles. When the massive convoy finally crested the hill and the palace, a colossal, sprawling monument to absolute power, came into view, the sight was breathtaking. It was a sun god's residence rendered in stone, gold leaf, and shimmering glass. But as the carriage passed through the iron gates and into the marble courtyard, the scale of human life and political intrigue within was far more terrifying than the architecture. Versailles was less a home and more an opera house where the drama was constant, the audience numbered in thousands, and the star was under perpetual scrutiny. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, stale powder, and ambition. Inside, Marie Antoinette was met by a deafening clamor of courtiers, over 10,000 people, all of varying degrees of nobility, who lived, jostled, and schemed within the palace walls, their sole purpose being proximity to the king. The light, reflected by countless mirrors and multiplied by what felt like 1,000 candles burning day and night, was blinding. This constant illumination was beautiful, but it was also a cruel, unceasing spotlight. There would be no shadows, no corners, and no privacy for the rest of her life. She had entered her golden cage. The tyranny of le service. From the moment she stepped onto French soil, Marie Antoinette's life ceased to be her own. It was governed by le service, the ancient, rigid, and absurd etiquette that structured every minute of the Bourbon court. Her Austrian training, though strict, was human. French protocol was divine, merciless, and designed to humiliate. Her first and most terrifying ordeal was the Grand Couvert, the public dinner where the king and the highest members of the royal family ate in silence while hundreds of the nobility stood around and watched. On her first night, she was led to a massive table set with gold plate. As she sat, stiff, corseted in heavy French silks, she realized that every movement, the raising of a spoon, the sip of wine, the cutting of a piece of meat, was judged. The room was deathly quiet, save for the scraping of cutlery and the occasional hushed whisper. She could feel the 1,000 eyes boring into her, dissecting her table manners, her posture, her complexion. She remembered the Abbé Vermont's warning. In Vienna, they look at you. In France, they dissect you. She was so mortified by the scrutiny that she could barely swallow a mouthful. This public theater, designed to reinforce the king's divinity, made her feel less like a dauphine and more like a circus exhibit. This ritual, she realized with a shudder, was not about eating, it was about control. It was the court's primary mechanism for ensuring the dauphine never forgot she was a foreigner and a subject of their critical gaze. But the Grand Couvert was merely a piece of the machine. Even waking up was a public affair. The lever, the rising, was a highly choreographed spectacle. When Marie Antoinette awoke, she was attended by a complex hierarchy of ladies-in-waiting. Only the highest-ranking lady of honor was allowed to hand her the chemises. On one awkward morning, the lady of honor was briefly out of the room, and a lesser duchess began to hand the garment to the dauphine. Just as Marie Antoinette reached for it, the lady of honor returned and snatched the chemise away, forcing the duchess to relinquish her duty. Marie was left standing, naked beneath her dressing gown, while a minor bureaucratic turf war played out over her undergarment. It was the epitome of Versailles, a life suffocated by ceremony, where rank superseded courtesy and the person beneath the crown was irrelevant. The austere family and the hated mistress. If the court was a gilded cage, her new family members were its watchful guardians. The first person to greet her after the formal exchange was Louis Gustave, the Dauphin, and her intended husband. He was 15, bulky, pious, and painfully shy. He had the physical awkwardness of a boy who preferred the solitude of a forge, his favorite hobby was locksmithing, to the demands of courtly charm. His face, often clouded by an expression of mild anxiety, offered her little reassurance. He spoke little to her, offered no compliment, and seemed utterly overwhelmed by the responsibility of matrimony. The distance between them was not physical, but an emotional chasm that the entire palace noticed instantly. The most critical voices belonged to Louis XV's 3 unmarried daughters, the Mesdames Tante, Adelaide, Victoria, and Sophie. These powerful, austere princesses lived in rigid adherence to the old court protocols and viewed Marie Antoinette, the daughter of the woman who had allied with France's ancient enemy, with suspicion that bordered on open hostility. They saw her Paris fashions as vulgar, her liveliness as frivolity, and her very existence as a dangerous Austrian influence. They were masters of the pointed silence and the judging glance, ensuring the Dauphine felt perpetually judged and unwelcome. But her greatest early antagonist was the king's mistress, Madame du Barry. Jeanne Bécu, Countess du Barry, was a dazzling, controversial figure, a commoner raised to power through her relationship with the king. To the Madame Tante, du Barry was an insult to the throne. To Marie Antoinette, she was an object of moral outrage instilled by her mother's strict values. Her instinct was to follow her family's lead and refuse to speak to the mistress, a refusal that became her first major political blunder.
To shun du Barry was to shun the king, Louis XV himself, whose happiness was entirely dependent on the mistress. The court immediately polarized. The Austrian alliance was put at risk because of a teenaged girl's refusal to address a courtesan. The Queen Mother, Maria Theresa, wrote frantic letters, relayed through Ambassador Mercy, demanding her daughter swallow her pride and speak to du Barry, stressing that the peace of Europe was more important than a few ridiculous scruples. For over a year, Marie Antoinette stubbornly maintained her silence, a decision born of youthful moral rigidity that only heightened her isolation and created a powerful, dedicated enemy in du Barry's faction. The unspoken barrier. Adding to the crushing weight of public life was the profound, isolating failure of her marriage. The Dauphin, Louis Auguste, was not merely shy, he was incapable of performing his conjugal duties. The marriage remained unconsummated. The reasons were complex. Louis Auguste likely suffered from phimosis, a physical condition, but his emotional and intellectual detachment was equally damning. He was courteous, but cold. He respected her position, but he did not love her person. While Marie Antoinette was expected to be witty, charming, and the focal point of courtly pleasure, the Dauphin preferred hunting for 12 hours straight, returning exhausted, or retreating to his private library or forge. The empty marriage bed was the great unspoken secret of Versailles, yet it was whispered about in every salon and drawing room. It made Marie Antoinette's position dangerously precarious. The primary goal of a Dauphiné was to produce heirs, cementing the dynasty and the alliance through the birth of a healthy heir. But her failure to do so, though entirely the fault of her husband, was laid squarely at her door. The court, eager to see the Austrian alliance fail, circulated vicious rumors about her barrenness and her coldness. The Dauphin's detachment was Marie Antoinette's deepest personal heartbreak in those early years. She was a vibrant, passionate girl of 15, trapped in a public marriage to a man who, by every measure, failed to acknowledge her as a wife. She was lonely, sexually frustrated, and had no private champion in the man who mattered most: the watchful eyes of Vienna. The isolation of the Golden Cage was intensified by the knowledge that she was still being governed from afar. Ambassador Mercy d'Argenteau, Maria Theresa's faithful representative in Paris, was her shadow. Mercy's daily letters back to the Empress were minute-by-minute reports on Marie Antoinette's behavior: what she ate, whom she spoke to, what dress she wore, and, most importantly, the progress, or lack thereof, of the alliance. Mercy was not a friend. He was an agent of the Empress, tasked with molding the Dauphiné into the perfect Austrian tool. When she was too frivolous, Mercy reported it. When she was too stubborn, as in the du Barry affair, Mercy delivered the Empress's icy scolding. Marie Antoinette understood that she had traded her mother's stern scrutiny for the perpetual surveillance of Mercy. Trapped between the frigid indifference of her husband, the hostility of the king's family, the poisonous envy of the court, and the constant critical reports back to Vienna, the Dauphiné sought an escape. She had a magnificent palace, unlimited funds, and 1,000 candles illuminating her every move, yet she was utterly, tragically alone. This was the core tragedy of Versailles. The dazzling opulence served only to magnify the depth of her isolation, forcing her, a foreign girl of 15, to invent her own world of distraction to survive the crushing scrutiny of the golden cage. The unconsummated union. The early frustrations of a Dauphiné. Versailles in the early 1770s was a palace built on spectacle and rooted in necessity. The entire purpose of the Austrian Dauphiné, Marie Antoinette, was dynastic. She was a vessel meant to secure the Bourbon lineage and cement the fragile Franco-Austrian alliance through the birth of a healthy heir. By 1772, 2 years after her dazzling arrival, the palace's golden light could no longer conceal the paralyzing failure at the very heart of the monarchy. The royal marriage remained unconsummated. This failure was not a private tragedy, it was a state crisis. The Dauphiné's womb was considered the property of France, and its stillness was the most potent weapon wielded by her enemies. For Marie Antoinette, the empty marriage bed became the ultimate symbol of her isolation, a daily humiliating reminder that she was failing at the one task for which she had been meticulously prepared since childhood. The ritual of the empty bed. The life of the Dauphin and the Dauphinée was a study in public proximity and private distance. They inhabited the same apartments, appeared at the same rituals, and were governed by the same crushing schedule, yet they were worlds apart. The most agonizing ritual was the coucher. This was the end of the day's public spectacle, yet still intensely public. Surrounded by high-ranking courtiers, Marie Antoinette would be undressed by her ladies, and Louis Auguste by his gentlemen. The couple would then be presented with their night clothes. They would exchange stiff, courteous nods, and finally, ceremonially, retreat into the immense, ornate state bed. As the curtains were drawn and the last courtier bowed out, the silence in the chamber was not intimacy, but emptiness. Louis Auguste, exhausted by a long day of hunting or satisfied by an hour in his locksmith's shop, would often fall instantly into a deep, heavy sleep. Marie Antoinette, a vibrant, passionate girl and a newly adolescent, would lie awake beside him.
She would watch the heavy, silent bulk of her husband, a man who treated her with polite indifference, incapable of reading the profound loneliness in her eyes. There was no conversation, no tenderness, and no physical connection. His avoidance was not malicious. It was rooted in deep shyness, lack of confidence, and perhaps a genuine physical problem, later suspected to be phimosis. But to the Dauphine, it felt like rejection. She was trapped with a husband who was courteous enough to share a bed, but was emotionally and physically incapable of acknowledging her as a woman. Louis Auguste's true passion lay not with his wife, but with the mechanics of locks and keys. He would often wake before dawn to tend his forge, crafting intricate mechanisms in his small, smoky workshop, preferring the company of metal files to the embrace of his wife. This intellectual retreat, while innocent, only deepened the chasm between them and fueled the humiliating rumors. The diplomacy of the womb. The silence of the Dauphine's bedroom was the loudest sound in Versailles, and its echo traveled quickly across borders. Ambassador Merci d'Argenteau, her mother's vigilant spy, reported the scandalous situation back to Vienna with excruciating detail. Empress Maria Theresa was in a state of permanent political panic. Her alliance was secured by her daughter's fertility. She instructed Merci to take the most invasive steps, questioning Marie Antoinette about her cycle, the Dauphine's habits, and even the precise location where they slept in the vast bed. The Empress's letters were a relentless torrent of political anxiety, masked as maternal guidance. You must use all your feminine wiles, all your charm to seduce your husband. You must engage him on his favorite subjects, even those tedious ones of hunting and locks, so that he becomes comfortable with your person. The alliance hangs on this.
You are sacrificing the peace of Europe for your girlish petulance." These letters were utterly humiliating. Marie Antoinette was now a pawn whose most private failure was the subject of high-level diplomatic correspondence. She was forced to host physicians who offered awkward, useless advice, and to endure the scrutiny of Mercy, who had become the unwelcome confessor of her conjugal shame. The political pressure made the physical act, had it been possible, psychologically impossible. The poison of public scrutiny. The court needed no ambassador to track the situation. The absence of a dauphin or dauphine quickly became the centerpiece of court gossip and political maneuvering. The factions that opposed the Austrian alliance, the Mesdames Tétantes and Madame du Barry, pounced. The whispers in the salons grew sharper. Is the Austrian girl cold? Is the dauphin impotent? The Bourbon line is cursed. Pamphlets, often paid for by du Barry's allies, began to circulate, featuring scandalous cartoons depicting Louis Auguste as a simpleton and Marie Antoinette as a frigid, barren foreigner. The constant surveillance turned into open hostility. The Mesdames Tétantes found endless excuses to criticize Marie Antoinette's clothing, her French, and every move, linking her perceived frivolity to her failure to secure the succession. The humiliation was overwhelming. To be judged a failure at the age of 16, not just by a few, but by an entire nation and two powerful empires, was a crushing burden. She lacked a single champion in the family who could deflect the criticism. Louis Auguste, buried in his forge, offered no public defense of his wife. She was forced to endure the shame alone, a public figure whose deepest private wound was the source of her political vulnerability. The flight into frivolity. The psychological reaction to this pervasive emotional void was the turning point in Marie Antoinette's character and public image. If she could not find solace or love in the marriage bed, she would seek distraction and freedom elsewhere. The failure of the union became the trigger for her notorious extravagance. She began to spend vast sums on clothes, jewelry, and most importantly, on her friends. These new fast friendships, with figures like the Prince de Ligne and later the Princesse de Lamballe, offered the genuine warmth and acceptance she did not receive from her husband or the court. She threw herself into a furious, exhausting cycle of pleasure. Masked balls became her greatest escape. Attending them often meant secretly slipping out of Versailles late at night, shedding the oppressive weight of her Dauphine identity, and mingling anonymously with Parisian society. For a few hours, hidden behind a velvet mask, she was not the scrutinized foreign pawn. She was simply a playful, witty young woman. This taste of liberty was intoxicating, yet it was also highly dangerous, exposing her to criticism about her low company and her disregard for decorum. She also developed a passion for gambling, hosting increasingly reckless card parties that lasted until dawn, losing and sometimes winning astronomical sums. The adrenaline, the noise, the sheer rush of extravagance all served as a temporary anesthetic for the pain of her empty life. The court looked at her frantic search for distraction and saw only reckless expenditure and moral decay. They coined the term the Austrian with venom, blaming her foreign blood for the perceived corruption of French morals. The heartbreak of the Dauphine, born of loneliness and marital failure, was thus carefully repackaged and sold to the French people as the selfishness and frivolity of a spendthrift foreigner. The unconsummated union had not only failed to secure the alliance, it had actively created the very public image that one day would condemn her. Part 2. The Rise of the Misunderstood Icon. The Court of Whispers, battling the enduring label of the Austrian woman. The year 1774 brought an abrupt, terrifying end to the long and tedious wait for power. In May, as smallpox swept through Versailles, Louis XV was struck down. The Dauphin and Dauphine, following the required protocol for fear of contagion, waited in a nearby apartment. When a candle was extinguished in the king's room, the signal that the monarch had drawn his last breath, a deafening rush was heard outside their doors. It was the sound of the entire court, a tide of ambition and subservience abandoning the body of the dead king and flooding the corridor to pay homage to the new sovereign. Louis Auguste, barely 20, dropped to his knees with Marie Antoinette beside him. He cried out, "We are too young to reign. My God, guide us and protect us." Marie Antoinette said, "My anxiety is terrible. I have no one to guide me. It will be terrible to be by myself." Marie Antoinette, Queen of France at the age of 18, felt a far more complex surge of emotion. Terror, certainly, but also a fierce, long-suppressed sense of opportunity. The gilded cage of the Dauphinette was gone. She was now the queen. She could finally shed the crippling insecurity of her first 4 years. Yet the crown that now rested on her head did not offer sanctuary. It merely amplified the malignant whispers that had plagued her since she crossed the Rhine. The Austrian woman, l'Autrichienne, this label was not merely an epithet, it was a curse. The poison of the Habsburg name. The animosity toward the new queen had deep historical roots. The term l'Autrichienne tapped into centuries of Franco-Austrian rivalry made raw by the recent and controversial alliance that had cost France dearly in the 7 Years' War. To the French public, Austria was synonymous with military defeat, foreign interference, and a cold, grasping nature. Every act Marie Antoinette performed was filtered through this prejudiced lens. Her natural Viennese gaiety was interpreted as foreign levity. Her attempts to introduce new fashions were seen as Austrian extravagance. Her failure to produce an heir, still the central unaddressed crisis, was evidence that her foreign blood was barren or cursed. Her first act as queen was symbolically decisive. Madame du Barry, her nemesis, who had been successfully undermining her for years, was summarily banished from court. The Madame Tétante, her constant critics, found their influence waning. For a brief moment, Marie Antoinette felt she had won a battle. But winning a battle only provoked a full-scale war with the anonymous, potent power of public opinion. The court, deprived of its old scapegoats and rivals, now focused its entire venom on the young queen. They were jealous of her power, resentful of her high-handed removal of du Barry, and profoundly unsettled by her determination to break the stifling protocols of Versailles.
The weapon of fashion, Rose Bertin and the Pouf. Driven by the need to silence the whispers of her supposed foreign taste and establish herself as the unrivaled leader of European culture, Marie Antoinette decided to fight back with the most French of all weapons, fashion. She elevated Rose Bertin, a brilliant and ambitious milliner from Paris, into her personal minister of fashion. Together, they revolutionized dress, turning clothes from mere covering into a bold, expressive political statement. The era of the pouf was born. These were towering, often absurdly complex hairstyles built on wire frames, horsehair, and pomade, sometimes reaching 3 feet high and adorned with miniature ships, flowers, elaborate scenes, and even political commentary. Marie Antoinette's intention was complex. She aimed to inject vitality into the staid, old-fashioned Bourbon court and assert her personal, modern aesthetic dominance. She thought that if she was the undisputed queen of French style, she could not simultaneously be the despised foreign woman. But the plan backfired catastrophically. The dizzying expense of these creations fueled the emerging propaganda machine. When a ship model was worn in her hair, the public did not see French artistry. They saw a queen so frivolous she wore the cost of a battleship on her head, while the nation starved. The cost of the silks, the ribbons, and the new perfumes, all reported and exaggerated in scurrilous, widely circulated pamphlets called libelles, became a symbol of the monarchy's detachment. The court, forced to follow her lead, secretly despised the expense and the novelty. They saw her as defying tradition and wasting funds. The whispers became a chorus. Only a foreign woman, an Austrian, would destroy the dignity of our court with such vulgar, expensive excess. The tight circle and the charges of favoritism. As her unpopularity grew, Marie Antoinette retreated further into a tight, exclusive inner circle of friends, creating a fortress of genuine affection against the court's icy hostility. This move, rooted in a heartbreaking need for unconditional love, was perhaps the most damaging to her political standing. Her closest confidants were the Princesse de Lamballe and later Yolande de Polignac. Yolande, a charming but politically naive woman, quickly became her greatest favorite. For Marie Antoinette, these women offered the easy conversation, laughter, and intimacy she was denied by her husband and her official duties. They were the substitute family she lost at Schönbrunn. But to the court, the favoritism was scandalous. Marie Antoinette showered her friends with titles, appointments, and pensions drawn from the public purse. Polignac alone received hundreds of thousands of livres for her family. This was not unusual for a French monarch, but it was disastrously timed. As the French treasury teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, the public saw her not as companions, but as greedy foreign leeches sucking the lifeblood out of the state at the behest of the queen. The accusation of Austrian influence was instantly attached to the Polignac gang. Why is the queen spending money on these unknown friends? The answer supplied by the libelles was always the same. Because she cares nothing for France, she is only loyal to her foreign circle. The final political confirmation. The whispers solidified into political conviction when she began to lobby the king directly on behalf of her birth country. Ambassador Mercy d'Argenjulo, seizing the opportunity of her newfound status as queen, increased his pressure dramatically. The most critical moment was the Bavarian succession crisis, 1778. Austria, under Marie Antoinette's brother, Joseph II, attempted to seize parts of Bavaria. Louis XVI, by treaty, was technically obligated to oppose Austria. Mercy, however, used the queen to exert relentless influence on her husband. She pleaded, she cajoled, she wept. Louis XVI, desperate to please his wife, who he could still not physically connect with, adopted a weak, ambiguous stance on the conflict. To the entire French court and the foreign ministers, this confirmed the worst possible scenario. The queen was a spy. She was an Austrian agent, using her charm and power to bend the will of the weak Louis XVI to the advantage of the Habsburgs. The name l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, had now been fully justified in the eyes of the French populace. It no longer just signified her birthplace, it signified treason. Marie Antoinette, in her early reign, had tried to find happiness, assert her authority, and secure affection. In her despair over the unconsummated union, she had sought escape in fashion and friendship. But every attempt at self-expression was weaponized against her, proving that the deepest heartbreak of her life at Versailles was not the gilded cage of the palace, but the indelible political cage of her foreign name. She was battling not a person, but an idea, and that idea was winning. Part 2. The Rise of the Misunderstood Icon. The tyranny of fashion, a queen's costly distraction from duty.
The golden cage of Versailles was unbearable only when its occupant was forced to confront the political realities outside its bars. The unconsummated marriage, the hostile court, the relentless scrutiny from Vienna, and the crushing weight of the Austrian woman label. As Marie Antoinette moved past her initial painful years as Dauphine and into her role as queen, she realized that control was an illusion. She could not control her husband's shyness, her mother's demands, or the political debts of the crown. There was, however, one arena where she reigned supreme: style. Fashion became her narcotic, her shield, and her singular act of defiance against a world that had rejected her person. It was a tyranny she willingly embraced, a constant, extravagant effort that demanded her attention and her kingdom's resources. The result was a glorious, self-destructive campaign of aesthetic revolution that distracted her completely from the mounting storm of national debt and the cries of the starving populace outside the palace gates.
The Minister of Vanity, Rose Bertin. At the heart of this consuming distraction was Rose Bertin, the Queen's modiste. Bertin was not merely a dressmaker, she was the architect of Marie Antoinette's entire public persona. Ambitious, audacious, and a genius at promotion, Bertin established her own rules, refusing to bow before the nobility and dealing only with the highest ranks. Their collaboration was manic and relentless. The Queen required not simply beautiful dresses, but new ones, dozens of gowns, coats, and accessories per month, each an ephemeral masterpiece. The cost of a single ceremonial dress could equal the annual wage of a French worker. The psychological payout for Marie Antoinette was immense. When she slipped into a new Bertin creation, meticulously fitted and perfectly accessorized, the anxieties of the court seemed to momentarily vanish. The heavy ceremonial robes of the previous queens, which stifled movement and personality, were replaced by lightweight gaules and robes à la polonaise, freer, flowing dresses that allowed her to breathe, move, and crucially, to be noticed. She commanded attention not through rank alone, but through sheer, unadulterated, dazzling style. But this personal victory came at a staggering financial and diplomatic cost. The court protocol dictated that her old clothes should be distributed to the ladies-in-waiting. However, the Queen's style changed so rapidly that dresses often went out of fashion before they could be worn even once. They accumulated in vast, unused piles, a tangible symbol of waste that Ambassador Mercier d'Argenteau frantically detailed in his reports back to Vienna. The Queen's expenses on finery are excessive and inexplicable. She simply cannot resist a novelty. Maria Theresa's scolding letters, focusing on the danger of bankrupting the French crown, were ignored, overshadowed by the latest samples from Bertin's salon. The architecture of absurdity, the pouf. The most infamous product of this distraction was the pouf, the towering, gravity-defying hair constructions that became the defining fashion statement of her early reign. These were more than hairstyles. They were temporary architectural projects, often rising 3 feet above the Queen's head, built from internal frames of wire and gauze, coated in flour and pomade, and accessorized with elaborate thematic elements. Marie Antoinette and Bertin created the pouf au sentiment, decorated with miniature flowers and caged birds, or the infamous pouf à la inoculation, celebrating the king's successful smallpox vaccination with a rising sun and olive branches. In 1778, after a naval victory, she wore the pouf à la belle poule, featuring a perfectly rendered scale model of a French frigate.
These styles were meant to be bold, witty, and uniquely French, a counterargument to the accusation that she was a drab Austrian. Instead, they became the ultimate visual representation of her detachment from the growing social crisis. When the price of bread skyrocketed and the poor struggled to buy flour, the idea of the queen plastering her hair with pounds of it, simply for style, invited searing satire. The libelles, or slanderous pamphlets that circulated in Paris marketplace, were ferocious. They featured caricatures of the queen with grotesque, unbalanced heads, equating the height of her hair with the height of the national debt. The absurdity of a ship in her hair while the Treasury desperately needed funds for the Navy was not lost on the increasingly radicalized public. She was not the fashionable idol she intended to be. She was becoming the public enemy, a symbol of the aristocracy's moral and fiscal bankruptcy. The allure of the gem, the diamond distraction. Beyond the fleeting luxury of silks and feathers lay the more permanent, dangerous allure of diamonds. Jewelry, unlike clothes, held its value. It was a visible, tangible symbol of status and wealth that seemed to reassure the queen of her untouchable position. Marie Antoinette developed an insatiable appetite for diamonds, often pressuring the king to purchase extraordinary pieces even when the royal treasury was nearly empty. Her acquisition of diamonds and rubies became less about adornment and more about compulsion, a desperate attempt to fill the emotional void left by her distant husband and her hostile environment. This obsession became the fatal setup for her greatest political disaster. Diamond merchants, knowing the queen's weakness, began to court her and her favorites, presenting grand, astronomically expensive sets, often on extended credit or through dubious channels. It was rumored that she had a secret chamber where she would simply look at the accumulated jewels, a private display of wealth that calmed her anxieties. This reckless fascination established a pattern of financial irresponsibility and a reliance on intermediaries for lavish transactions, a pattern that would, tragically, be exploited by swindlers and political enemies in the infamous affair of the diamond necklace, a disaster waiting to happen built entirely on the queen's known costly distraction. Duty abandoned, and the price of pleasure. Marie Antoinette's obsessive pursuit of pleasure was a direct evasion of the increasing complexities of her royal duty. The hours spent with Rose Bertin, trying on new accessories, gossiping with her friends, or gambling until dawn were hours taken directly from ministerial meetings, political reading, or genuine attempts to connect with the king on matters of state. Louis XVI, though intelligent, was paralyzed by indecision and preferred a structured life. He needed a partner to engage him on policy. Instead, he found a wife whose conversation revolved around the latest opera or the newest hairstyle. Their emotional distance deepened further because their interests were so diametrically opposed. He retreated further into his hunting and locks. She retreated further into her dressing room and masked balls. This flight into fashion was the queen's final, heartbreaking mistake of her early reign. It provided temporary psychological relief, making her the most stylish woman in Europe, but it simultaneously solidified her image as Madame Déficit and l'Autrichienne. Her expensive distraction from duty was in the end an act of self-sabotage, sowing the seeds of contempt that would ultimately bloom into revolution.
The search for a private life and the price of escape. The relentless pressure of the French court, the shame of the unconsummated marriage, the tyranny of fashion, and the constant, critical gaze of the l'Autrichienne label had forced Marie Antoinette to seek more than distraction. She craved disappearance. She needed a place where the weight of the crown could be set down, where she could be the true sovereign, and where the archaic rules of Versailles were null and void. In 1774, shortly after his coronation, Louis XVI gave his wife the ultimate expression of royal indulgence, the Petit Trianon. This small, exquisite chateau, nestled within the sprawling park of Versailles, was his quiet acknowledgement of her misery. "It is your place, madame," he is said to have told her, "your refuge. Only you may rule there." Marie Antoinette seized the gift with the desperate energy of a prisoner granted parole. Trianon was to be her sanctuary, a physical shield against the political intrigue and the suffocating demands of le service. But the act of creating this private world, though a search for personal happiness, became her most fatal political mistake, sealing her isolation from the people she governed. The laws of exclusion. The Queen's first decrees at Trianon were revolutionary and instantly polarizing. She announced that the ancient, rigid hierarchy of the court would stop at the chateau's gates. Rank, title, and birthright meant nothing here. Only the Queen's explicit invitation granted entry. This was a direct, calculated insult to the old French nobility. For centuries, the right to approach the king or the queen, the privilege of mere physical proximity, was the currency of Versailles. To be barred from Trianon or to be forced to wait while a mere favorite like the Polignac family strolled through was an offense to ancient privilege. It signaled that the young queen valued genuine affection and wit over inherited rank. The exclusion fueled the court's fury. The disgruntled nobility, stripped of their precious access, retreated to the salons of Paris, where they became the most effective propagandists against the queen. They portrayed Trianon as a den of vice, a secluded theater where the queen and her favorites engaged in secret, lavish parties and morally questionable pastimes. The whisper campaign surrounding Trianon created a psychological distance that was far more damaging than the physical distance from Versailles. Marie Antoinette, cocooned in her private bubble, dismissed the anger as petty jealousy, failing to grasp the political power of the nobility's wounded pride. She was happy, and therefore dangerously complacent. The architectural dream, escaped through artifice. The creation of Trianon was driven by the fashionable philosophy of the day, Romanticism. Influenced by the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which extolled the virtue of nature and the simple life, Marie Antoinette set about transforming the formal, symmetrical French gardens into a naturalistic jardin anglo-chinois. This transformation required vast expenditures. She had lakes dug, hills sculpted, and forests thinned. The king, delighted to see his wife happy, indulged her every whim. She commissioned the small, exquisite theater, where she and her friends, even her husband, could shed their regal formality and act in plays, mostly light comedies. For the queen, the theater was another form of necessary escape. When she played the roles of chambermaids, milkmaids, or village girls, she was shedding the physical and emotional constraints of the Dauphine who was stripped on the Rhine island. It was a momentary, liberating rejection of the heavy brocade and diamond weight of the crown. But the pursuit of this idealized artistic freedom was seen by outsiders as irresponsible self-absorption. While the queen acted out pastoral fantasies, the real French drama, poverty and debt, was escalating. The rustic illusion, the Queen's Hamlet. The culmination of the Trianon project was the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. Constructed in the early 1800s, the hamlet was not merely an elaborate decoration. It was a fully functional, idealized peasant village. It featured a rustic farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, and a working vegetable garden, all built to a standard of impeccable, costly perfection. The queen would retreat here with her closest friends and often accompanied by her husband, after their birth finally secured her position. She would dress in simple muslin gauze dresses, a dramatic break from the heavy court silks. She would play at being a fermière. Her ladies would milk the specially cleaned cows, which sometimes wore ribbons, and her children would feed the sheep. This was her purest search for a private life, a space where sincerity and simplicity ruled, a safe haven where she was a mother and a friend rather than a political pawn. However, the political absurdity of this project was devastating. The cost of constructing and maintaining this perfect theatrical vision of poverty was astronomical. The public, fueled by pamphlets describing the queen playing shepherdess in a silk dress with crystal milk pails, saw the hamlet not as an emotional refuge, but as the height of aristocratic cynicism. The queen was mocking the very people whose toil kept the nation running, proving that her life was a continuous, expensive theatrical performance. The price of escape, detachment and deficit. The final and most tragic price of triomphe was political detachment. By spending more and more time within the safety of her enclave, the queen deliberately cut herself off from the primary means of communication with her people, the court. She no longer heard the genuine complaints of the nobility, the political maneuverings of the ministers, or the true state of the nation's finances. Her perception of France was filtered solely through the loyal, self-serving voices of her triomphe circle, particularly the Polignacs, who encouraged her excesses and protected her from any unpleasant truths. Her repeated withdrawals compounded her image as Madame Deficit, while the nation's finance ministers, like Jacques Necker, struggled to manage the immense debts left by the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. The Queen's ongoing expenses at Prayon became a powerful, visible liability. The people began to associate the national debt directly with the frivolous, secretive life she led behind the thick walls of her private park. Marie Antoinette found her private life, but she lost her public one. Her search for genuine happiness in her artificial village made her appear uncaring and blind to the real suffering of the French people. She was safe within her idyllic retreat, but that very safety ensured she was entirely unprepared for the political storm gathering outside the walls of her beloved and costly escape.
The Fersen Enigma and the Queen's Confidants. Marie Antoinette was queen of the greatest kingdom in Europe, surrounded by thousands of courtiers, yet she lived in a state of profound emotional starvation. The empty marriage bed, the relentless criticism, and the cold, unyielding formality of Versailles had created a vast, aching void in her heart. By the late 1770s, her extravagant fashion and her artificial refuge at Trianon were no longer sufficient to fill that emptiness. She needed people, not subjects, not flatterers, but genuine, unconditional human connection. Her search for intimacy led her to cultivate a close, loyal, and disastrously expensive circle of confidants. This reliance on a private emotional shield was a direct result of her heartbreak, but it exposed her to charges of nepotism and created powerful enemies among the older nobility who resented their exclusion. The shield of affection, Lamballe and Polignac. The two most prominent women in this inner sanctuary were studies in contrast, yet both served the same purpose, to be the Queen's emotional ballast. The Princess de Lamballe, Marie-Thérèse, was loyal, sensitive, and melancholic, with a quiet devotion that bordered on adoration. She served as the Queen's superintendent of the household, a role that gave her high status and a large salary, drawing immediate scrutiny. Lamballe offered the queen passive, unquestioning solidarity. Her affection was a soft pillow against the barbs of court gossip. Then there was Yolande de Polignac, a woman whose charm and wit were magnetic and whose ambition was initially disguised by her easy manners. Polignac became the queen's great favorite, quickly rising from a relatively minor noble to the Duchess of Polignac, showered with pensions and powerful appointments for her entire family. Marie Antoinette's dependence on Polignac was nearly absolute. She saw in Yolande the vibrant, carefree sister she had left behind in Vienna. The two spent endless hours together at Trianon, acting in plays, gossiping and laughing. Simple human moments denied to the queen in the rest of her public life. The political damage wrought by this favoritism was enormous. To the public, Polignac and her circle were not friends, but leeches. The enormous sums of money lavished upon them were interpreted as the queen wantonly draining the public purse to satisfy her own selfish desires for company. The court, excluded from the Trianon, used the favoritism scandal to confirm the deepest fears about l'Autrichienne. She was loyal only to her foreign circle and would sacrifice the nation's wealth for her own pleasure. The queen, consumed by the simple joy of having a friend, remained tragically oblivious to how her generosity was being weaponized against her. The comet's appearance. Count Axel von Fersen. In 1774, amidst the lavish chaos of a masked ball, Marie Antoinette met the man who would come to define the enigmatic side of her emotional life. Count Axel von Fersen, a handsome, reserved Swedish nobleman. Fersen was everything Louis XVI was not. He was dashing, elegant, a true man of the world who had traveled and served in foreign armies. Where Louis was awkward and hesitant, Fersen was confident and graceful. Crucially, Fersen possessed a quiet sincerity that immediately set him apart from the fawning French courtiers. The attraction was immediate and profound. Marie Antoinette, starved of male attention and trapped in an unloving marriage, saw in Fersen a mirror of the romantic ideal, a man capable of action, devotion, and sensitivity. Their connection transcended the frivolous nature of the masked ball where they met. It was deep, intellectual, and intensely emotional. Fersen soon departed for the American Revolutionary War, serving with distinction alongside Lafayette. His absence only intensified the Queen's feelings, transforming him in her mind from an attractive courtier to a chivalrous figure worthy of a royal romance. When he returned to Versailles in 1778, the depth of their relationship became the greatest enigma of the French court. The enigma, the nature of the bond. Was the relationship between Marie Antoinette and Axel von Fersen a passionate physical affair or a profound platonic soul connection? History provides no definitive, unassailable answer, which is precisely why the relationship remains the subject of endless debate. Fersen's later diary entries, often written in code, were heavily edited, but some of the remaining original lines hint at the most intimate connection. One chilling entry, written after a night spent in Versailles, reads simply, "I resolved to leave. It was done." The ambiguity allows for both possibilities, the quiet finality of a lover ending a painful affair, or the sober decision of a faithful friend to leave before an affair could truly begin. However, the nature of their bond was irrelevant to the public. The perception of scandal was enough, and the emotional reality, captured in their later letters, confirms a profound, consuming love. Their correspondence during the Revolution is filled with urgency, desperation, and an intimate concern for each other's person that goes far beyond friendship. Fersen risked his life countless times for her, a devotion that screams of a relationship rooted in deep mutual passion. The Queen relied on Fersen not just for affection, but as a political and emotional confidant, a man who offered her intelligent conversation and strategic advice, something her husband was too passive to provide. Fersen was her champion and her truth-teller, the only man at court who dared to treat her as an equal rather than a queen or a pawn. The remarkable and equally enigmatic fact was Louis XVI's reaction. While the king was utterly consumed by the hunting reports and his locksmith's bench, he seemed to accept Fersen's presence with extraordinary placidity. Perhaps he was simply too emotionally detached or too intellectually trusting to suspect the danger. Or perhaps, in his own shy way, Louis XVI was grateful that Fersen provided his wife with the emotional fulfillment he was incapable of giving her, allowing him to retreat further into his own private world. The cost of trust. Marie Antoinette's reliance on her confidants and her closeness to Fersen was the ultimate expression of her hidden heartbreak. It was a search for the simple, genuine warmth of human connection that her royal destiny had denied her. But in the charged, paranoid atmosphere of Versailles, her emotional need was quickly transformed into political ammunition. The court saw the relationship with Fersen as proof of her moral decay. The public libels described her as a promiscuous, adulterous sovereign, an Austrian whore who was corrupting the French line. The profound loyalty of Fersen and the Polignacs brought Marie Antoinette her only true moments of happiness and sanity during her years in the golden cage. Yet by making her personal emotional life so dependent on such a small, non-French circle, she inadvertently provided her enemies with the most powerful tools to destroy her reputation and to justify the public's eventual hatred. Her private search for love became her greatest public liability.
Motherhood and the dawn of maturity. By 1777, Marie Antoinette had survived 6 years of the golden cage, the unconsummated marriage, and the venom of the L'Autrichienne label. Her refuge lay in the arms of confidants and the elaborate, expensive theater of Trianon. Yet the foundational flaw in her queenship, the absence of an heir, remained, a political vulnerability that threatened the stability of the Bourbon line and the Franco-Austrian alliance. The shame, once personal, had become national. The lack of a pregnancy fueled the most vicious libels, suggesting the queen was sterile, or worse, that her husband was impotent. This profound crisis demanded intervention, and it came, in the spring of 1777, in the form of a blunt, fraternal command. The Austrian brothers' intervention. Emperor Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's older brother and the co-ruler of Austria, arrived at Versailles on an extended, crucial visit. Joseph was a product of the same pragmatic upbringing as his sister, but he was a man of cold Enlightenment logic. He came to France on a diplomatic mission, disguised as a fraternal tour, with one urgent mandate from Vienna: resolve the conjugal crisis. Joseph stayed for a month, observing the daily habits of the royal couple. He witnessed the passive indifference of Louis XVI, who preferred hunting and his forge to the company of his wife, and the nervous, overly anxious nature of Marie Antoinette. His diagnosis was as sharp as it was simple: ignorance and timidity. He took his brother-in-law, the King of France, aside for a series of brutally honest private conversations.
While the historical details of these talks are shrouded, Joseph's letters back to Vienna confirm his diagnosis. Louis XVI was physically capable, but lacked the requisite knowledge and confidence. He is an honest man, but a perfect clod, Joseph wrote. Joseph advised the king on the necessary physical correction, a minor surgery, likely on the foreskin, or simple instruction, but most importantly, on the need for emotional engagement. The intervention, shocking in its intimacy, finally broke the stalemate. Louis XVI, perhaps shamed or perhaps simply instructed, followed his brother-in-law's advice. The long, devastating 7-year period of unconsummated union was finally and privately resolved. For Marie Antoinette, the success was an immense, life-altering release. The crushing shame, the most personal heartbreak of her life, was lifted, replaced with a quiet, deep-seated sense of validation. The birth of Madame Royale, the Queen, is made. In the summer of 1778, the Queen's pregnancy was announced, silencing the court's worst whispers and sending a wave of relief across the two empires. The months of waiting were tense, but the anticipation was proof that Marie Antoinette was fulfilling her primary dynastic duty. The birth of a French heir was, by ancient tradition, a horrifying public spectacle. On December 19, 1778, when the Queen went into labor, the royal chambers were immediately thrown open to the public. As required, hundreds of courtiers, commoners, and even chimney sweeps elbowed their way into the room to witness the birth, ensuring no substitutions or conspiracies could take place. The air was thick, hot, and nearly suffocating. When the child finally emerged, the attending physician dramatically shouted, "La reine est accouchée," or "the Queen has delivered." But the collective gasp of the enormous crowd was one of disappointment. The child was a girl. A boy was the ultimate goal, but a girl, Marie Theresa, known as Madame Royale, was a welcome start. Marie Antoinette, exhausted and recovering from fainting due to the suffocating crowd, looked at her daughter. In that instant, everything shifted. The frivolous, pleasure-seeking girl who had obsessed over a new poof every week vanished. In her place emerged the mother, fiercely protective, profoundly centered, and finally endowed with a sense of purpose that transcended the political game. Her first act as a mother was to defy tradition. She refused to use the traditional aristocratic wet nurses who raised royal children impersonally. Instead, influenced by Rousseau's ideas on natural mothering, she insisted on closely supervising the care of her daughter, keeping her nearby, and fostering a genuine, affectionate bond. Her priorities had shifted from the superficial to the profound. The heir apparent, a political zenith. The birth of a daughter was a start, but the pressure for a dauphin remained. 3 years later, in October 1781, Marie Antoinette delivered a son, Louis-Joseph, the Dauphin of France. The public's reaction was one of genuine, widespread ecstasy. The birth was greeted not just with formal state announcements, but with spontaneous nationwide celebrations. When the news reached Paris, bells rang for hours, bonfires were lit, and the jubilant crowds rushed to Versailles to cheer the Queen. This moment was the absolute zenith of Marie Antoinette's political acceptance. She had secured the dynasty. She was now the undisputed mother of France. The constant attacks on her barrenness and foreignness were temporarily silenced. Motherhood brought about the dawn of maturity that no amount of tutoring or political scolding ever could. The Queen became demonstrably more serious, more cautious with her spending, and more focused on her husband and children. Her letters to her mother, before Maria Theresa's death, and to her friends became filled with nursery concerns, not frivolous gossip. She insisted on raising her children at Trianon, seeking to isolate them from the corrosive etiquette of Versailles. It was at the hameau that she was at her happiest, acting as a mother first, a queen second. She cultivated an environment where her children could be raised with relative simplicity and affection, a radical departure from the cold, formal atmosphere of her own childhood. This maternal devotion brought her closer to Louis XVI. The king, awkward with his wife, found an easy, shared duty in the love of their children. Their relationship, while never romantically passionate, became a genuine partnership of parenthood. The truly tragic irony of late maturity. Yet the cruelest aspect of Marie Antoinette's hidden heartbreak was the fact that her maturity came too late. She had finally transformed herself into the responsible, dignified queen France required, but the public image, forged by years of her own youthful extravagance and her enemies' malice, was already too hard to break. Her attempts to be a good mother were immediately warped by the propaganda machine. Très un homme, her decision to raise her children away from court was seen not as enlightened parenting, but as a further sign of foreign aloofness, isolating the heirs from the French people. The gall dress, her simple muslin dresses worn to play with her children, were initially mocked by the silk industry as destroying French trade, and then seized upon by libelles as proof of her moral laxity and foreign taste. The nation that had cheered the birth of her son in 1781 was the same nation that would just be 5 years later to believe the most outrageous lies about her. The years of Madame Deficit, the Austrian woman, and the frivolous queen had established a narrative of distrust that her sudden maternal maturity could not erase. Motherhood provided Marie Antoinette with a profound personal redemption and a purpose that finally anchored her soul. She achieved genuine stability and happiness at the core of her personal life. But this private fulfillment could not shield her from the public's relentless resentment, nor could it prevent the massive political and financial forces that were now rushing toward her. The true queen emerged just as the stage was being set for the final devastating act of the monarchy.
The lie that broke the crown's authority. By 1785, Marie Antoinette had matured into a devoted mother and a more responsible queen, largely retiring from the extreme frivolity of her early years. But the sins of her youth, the reputation for reckless spending, the association with questionable confidants, and her known obsession with expensive jewelry had hardened into an immutable public image, Madame Deficit. This carefully crafted image of irresponsibility became the perfect foundation upon which a lie of staggering proportions could be built, a lie that would ultimately destroy the moral standing of the French monarchy. The catalyst for this disaster was the diamond necklace, a piece of jewelry so magnificent and so cripplingly expensive that it existed in a realm of pure, destabilizing fantasy. The prize and the conspirators. The necklace, originally commissioned by Louis XV for his mistress, Madame du Barry, contained 647 flawless diamonds and carried a price tag of 1.6 million livres, a sum equivalent to that of a fully equipped battleship. After Louis XV's death, the court jewelers, Burmer and Bassange, were left with the unsold glittering burden. Desperate to recoup their investment, they repeatedly offered the necklace to Marie Antoinette. She, to her credit, had refused, stating, "We have more need of a battleship than of a diamond necklace." But her prior fixation with diamonds, coupled with her known financial fecklessness, made her refusal utterly unbelievable to the public. And it was this widely accepted belief in the Queen's insatiable vanity that drew the three central players into a dark, intricate web of fraud. The architect of the deception was Jeanne de la Motte, a brilliant, ruthless, and opportunistic con artist. Though impoverished, she was obsessed with her dubious claim to lineage from the Valois royal house. La Motte had wormed her way into Rohan's confidence by claiming to be a secret, intimate friend of the Queen,
hinting that she could broker the reconciliation the cardinal craved. The web of treachery. The elaborate fraud unfolded over 2 agonizing years. Lamotte convinced Rohan that the queen, although wishing to buy the magnificent necklace, could not do so publicly. Her reasons, according to Lamotte, were twofold. She feared the public and the king's reaction to the staggering cost, and she needed a trusted intermediary, Rohan, to handle the transaction in complete secrecy. The ultimate goal was to make Rohan believe he was doing the queen a secret loving favor that would secure her eternal gratitude. Lamotte provided Rohan with the series of fake, intimate, and increasingly demanding letters purportedly signed Marie Antoinette de France, expressing her desperate need for the diamonds. The climax of the emotional manipulation came in August 1784 in the Grove of Venus in the Versailles Park. Rohan was led to believe the queen was granting him a clandestine audience. Under the cloak of night, a prostitute hired by Lamotte, dressed in a simple queen-like gown, met Rohan. The encounter lasted mere moments. The impostor handed Rohan a rose, whispering, "You may hope that your past errors are forgotten." Rohan, blinded by euphoria and vanity, walked away convinced that the queen's secret passion and his restoration to favor. The trap was sprung. The jewelers, Burmer and Bassange, were shown the fake letters and, convinced of the queen's involvement, agreed to sell the necklace to Rohan on credit. The climax and the public exposure. On January 29, 1785, Cardinal Rohan, believing he was acting for the most beautiful woman in the world, received the diamond necklace. He immediately took it to Lamotte, who, claiming she would deliver it to the queen, instead had her husband break the piece into smaller, saleable segments. The diamonds were quickly smuggled to London and sold on the black market. The first installment on the necklace was due in August 1785, and payment never arrived. The jewelers, now frantic, approached the queen directly, handing her a bill and asking for payment for a necklace she knew nothing about. Marie Antoinette, outraged at the audacity, believed they were simply trying to trick her into buying the piece she had already refused. She tore up the note and dismissed them. A second payment deadline passed. The jewelers, now convinced they had been duped by the monarchy itself, finally told their story to the king, Louis XVI. The king and queen were horrified. The revelation that the highest clergyman in France had been duped by a common swindler using the queen's name was a political earthquake. Louis XVI, convinced that only a public display of justice could clear his wife's name and the crown's honor, made a catastrophic decision. On August 15, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, Cardinal Rohan was arrested in his full robes in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, an unprecedented humiliation for the Church and the monarchy. The king, in his desire for transparent justice, had turned a private criminal affair into a sensational national spectacle. The trial that broke the crown's authority. The ensuing trial was held before the Parlement de Paris, the highest court of appeal, packed with hostile nobles and lawyers eager to air their anti-monarchical sentiments. The trial became less about criminal fraud and more about the morality and trustworthiness of the queen. Marie Antoinette, utterly confident in her innocence, demanded that the court deliver the truth. But the French public did not believe in her innocence. They reasoned, the queen is Madame Deficit. She is known to be reckless and obsessed with diamonds. Why would she suddenly become responsible? The cardinal's motive. Rohan's motive was to gain her favor. If she was innocent, why did she allow such a man to believe he had a secret channel to her? On May 31, 1786, the Parlement de Paris delivered its shocking verdict. Cardinal Rohan was acquitted of all charges of high treason, receiving the court's sympathy as an ambitious but honest dupe. Jeanne de la Motte was convicted of fraud, branded with a V for voleuse, thief, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The acquittal of the cardinal was a devastating political verdict on the Queen. The public interpreted the outcome as a confirmation that the cardinal was an honorable man and the Queen was the real criminal. They believed that the Queen had secretly ordered the necklace, used Rohan to acquire it to bypass the treasury, and then attempted to frame the innocent cardinal when the payment failed. The long-term damage. The acquittal of Rohan broke the last remnants of the crown's moral authority. Louis XVI had sought public justice, but the trial had delivered a public condemnation of his wife and, by extension, his rule. The scandal's impact was not financial. The king eventually paid off the necklace's debt, but existential. The French people now believed their queen was not merely frivolous, but a malicious, lying manipulator. It stripped the monarchy of the sacred reverence that had sustained it for centuries, replacing trust with cynicism and contempt. Marie Antoinette, though technically vindicated by the conviction of La Motte, was heartbroken. Her innocence was irrelevant. The public had already judged her guilty. Her reputation, carefully rebuilt through motherhood and maturity, was shattered beyond repair. She retreated further into the private sanctuary of Trianon, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The diamond necklace deception had done more than steal diamonds. It had stolen the Queen's reputation, the King's moral standing, and the sacred legitimacy of the Bourbon throne, pushing France irrevocably toward the precipice of revolution.
The malicious myth that defined a monarchy. The years immediately following the diamond necklace affair, 1786 onwards, saw the collapse of the crown's credibility and the dramatic acceleration of the national financial crisis. With the treasury empty and the French populace reeling from poor harvests, the one thing that mattered above all was bread. The staple food of the vast majority of the Third Estate, bread was the measure of life itself. When the price of a loaf soared, consuming up to 80% of a laborer's daily wage, hunger turned into desperation, and desperation sought a visible target. That target, already wounded and bleeding from the necklace scandal, was the Queen. It was in this atmosphere of famine, rage, and moral contempt that the most famous, most destructive, and most fundamentally inaccurate slander in monarchical history took root. If they have no bread, let them eat cake. This myth became the final malicious stroke that defined the Queen's reign and sealed the monarchy's fate. It was a lie so perfect, so simple, and so easily digestible that it instantly eclipsed the complex political realities of the French crisis. The genealogy of slander, a lie reassigned. The malicious phrase, qu'il mange de la brioche, literally, let them eat brioche, a rich, sweetened bread, often translated as cake, did not originate with Marie Antoinette. It was a centuries-old piece of anti-aristocratic folklore, a literary device used to illustrate the utter detachment of the ruling class. The phrase was already famous decades before Marie Antoinette even set foot on French soil. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Confessions, written in the mid-1760s, recalled an incident where a great princess made the heartless remark. Historians have variously attributed the phrase to earlier French princesses, including Marie-Thérèse, wife of Louis XIV, or Madame Victoire, Louis XV's daughter. The quote was a floating piece of propaganda, waiting for the perfect host. Marie Antoinette, unfortunately, was that perfect host. Her existing image, the frivolous, extravagant Madame Deficit, who obsessed over the height of her pouf, made the attribution tragically believable. She was already guilty in the court of public opinion of excess.
The cake myth simply redefined that extravagance as cruelty. The public needed the myth to be true, the reality of complex decades-long financial mismanagement, expensive foreign wars like the American Revolution, and a hopelessly inefficient tax system was too confusing. The simple, venomous image of a foreign queen swimming in jewels and mocking the starving masses provided a clear, emotional focal point for the nation's profound anguish. The contrast of bread and gold. To understand the myth's power, one must understand the economic reality of the late 1780s. Bread was not a luxury, it was sustenance. The standard diet of a Parisian worker consisted primarily of bread, up to 2 pounds a day. The price of grain was tied to the political temperature of the city. As harvests failed, the price of bread soared from 4 sous per pound to nearly 8 sous, paralyzing the financial life of the Third Estate. When a family was forced to spend 3/4 of its income just to feed itself, every extra livre spent by the queen on a new set of diamonds or a party at Trianon was seen as an active theft from their mouths. The Palace of Versailles, with its shimmering gold, its endless feasts, and its 1,000 burning candles, stood in stark, unforgiving contrast to the bleak, hungry streets of Paris. The king and queen, insulated by layers of servants and ceremony, were utterly incapable of grasping the scale of the national desperation. The let them eat cake myth acted as the bridge between these two worlds. It connected the queen's known love of luxury, the cake, to the people's struggle for basic survival, the bread, creating a simple moral equation. The queen is the cause of our hunger. The weaponization of cruelty. The libelles, the cheap, often pornographic and always slanderous pamphlets that flooded Paris, seized the let-them-eat cake myth and ran with it. They transformed Marie Antoinette from a simple political figure into a moral monster. The pamphlets portrayed her as a cruel, cold-blooded tyrant who deliberately chose to ruin the French people out of sheer spite. Her femininity was inverted. She was not a nurturing mother, despite her devotion to her children, but a symbol of gluttony and destructive foreign appetites. The myth justified the growing political demand for revolutionary action. If the sovereign and his consort were so inhuman that they mocked the starvation of their people, then they had forfeited their divine right to rule, and any violence directed at them was morally sanctioned. The myth was a masterstroke of propaganda because it targeted the queen's deepest personal failing, her lack of political empathy, and her retreat into private luxury, and magnified it into a cosmic flaw. Her private, frivolous life was now interpreted as a direct, hostile act against the nation's poor. The fatal silence of the crown. The most tragic failure in the face of this malicious myth was the crown's utter inability to defend itself. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, bound by the rigid belief that the dignity of the monarchy precluded responding to low gossip, refused to issue any formal denial of the slander. To address a lie printed on cheap paper, they believed, would only lend it credibility. Their silence was interpreted by the public as tacit admission. Even Ambassador Mercy d'Arquinhot, her vigilant political monitor, failed to fully appreciate the psychological power of the myth. He continued to scold her for her excessive spending, viewing the cake story as merely another consequence of her extravagance, rather than an existential threat to the throne itself. Marie Antoinette, increasingly isolated in Trianon, felt the sting of the myth keenly. She had performed genuine acts of charity, visiting hospitals, establishing homes for unwed mothers, and reducing her jewelry expenditures in her later years. Yet these quiet good deeds were never publicized, never believed, and never powerful enough to overcome the resounding malice of the cake story. The myth of let them eat cake was the ultimate victory of slander over truth. It was the simple, catchy slogan that encapsulated centuries of aristocratic mismanagement and detachment. It stripped Marie Antoinette of her humanity, defined the entire Bourbon monarchy as irrevocably callous and provided the moral fervor necessary for the violent destruction of the old regime. The lie had become the truth, and the monarchy was defined by the very cruelty it had never truly intended. Part 3. The Scandal and the Precipice. The Quiet Alarms, Marie Antoinette's pre-revolutionary foresight. The years between the devastating verdict of the Necklace Affair, 1786, and the storming of the Bastille, 1789, were deceptively quiet. The revolutionary energy had not yet burst onto the streets, but beneath the polished floors of Versailles, the foundational structures of the monarchy were crumbling rapidly. The great crisis was no longer one of diamond necklaces or unconsummated unions. It was one of money and will. Marie Antoinette, now 30 years old, had undergone a profound metamorphosis. Her youthful distractions, the extravagant fashion, the relentless gambling, and the private theater had faded, replaced by the grim sobriety of a woman who had seen her reputation destroyed and who was now forced to confront the abyss. The alarms that sounded across France were initially silent ones, financial, political, and personal, but the Queen, for the first time, heard them clearly. The actual debt of the Crown, exacerbated by the American War of Independence and decades of fiscal irresponsibility, had finally reached the point of national insolvency. Minister of Finance Charles de Calonne finally admitted the terrifying truth. The treasury was empty, and the only solution was to impose taxes on the privileged classes, the nobility and the clergy, who had been exempt for centuries.
Louis XVI, paralyzed by the enormity of the task, agreed to call the Assembly of Notables in 1787, a council of high-ranking nobles, magistrates, and bishops. The king believed they would assent to the necessary reforms. Instead, they refused to surrender their privileges, using the financial crisis as leverage to demand the removal of the king's ministers and, implicitly, a share of royal power. This political deadlock was the first quiet alarm the Queen heard. She watched, appalled, as the aristocracy, her natural allies, willingly sacrificed the stability of the monarchy to protect their tax exemptions. When Calonne failed, Marie Antoinette threw her political weight behind the appointment of the next minister, Loménie de Brienne, a man she hoped would be strong enough to force the issue. Her political intervention, though motivated by a desperate desire to save the crown, was immediately twisted by public opinion. The Parliament of Paris and the nobility declared that France was being ruled by a tyrannical foreign woman. Her influence, even when exercised for the good of the state, only fueled the cry that l'Autrichienne was subverting French sovereignty. The Queen's political awakening. The political impotence of Louis XVI in the face of the notables' defiance forced Marie Antoinette into a role she had spent a decade avoiding: active political engagement. She began attending ministerial meetings, a shocking breach of Bourbon custom, and spent long, tense hours urging her husband to act decisively. Her foresight was sharp and clear. She saw that the greatest danger was not the people, but the arrogant, self-serving nobility who were paralyzing the king. She warned Louis XVI against negotiating with the parliaments, the regional courts that now posed as the voice of the people, seeing them correctly as self-interested oligarchs rather than genuine constitutionalists. She wrote to her family, lamenting the king's inertia. The king is afraid to say yes and afraid to say no. His only wish is that the matter be decided without him. This heartbreak of this period was the Queen's powerless maturity. She had transformed from a frivolous girl into a sober woman with a clear-eyed view of political reality. Yet she could not transfer her will to her passive husband. Louis XVI, a man of deep piety and personal kindness,
believed his dignity was best preserved by avoiding confrontation. His failure to act, stemming from a flawed philosophy of kingship, was the most fatal flaw in the monarchy's defense. The Queen's political efforts only provided fresh ammunition for her enemies. When Brienne failed to force through the reforms, the parliaments directly blamed Marie Antoinette. She was publicly called Madame Deficit and accused of interfering to serve Austrian interests. Her genuine attempt to save the crown only convinced the public that she was the primary threat to French liberty. The Dauphine's shadow, a tragic diversion. As the political alarms reached their peak, a devastating personal tragedy consumed the royal couple and diverted their focus and emotional strength at the most crucial juncture. By 1788, the 4-year-old Dauphin, Louis Joseph, their firstborn son and the symbol of the dynasty's salvation, was gravely ill. He suffered from a debilitating spinal deformity, now believed to be tuberculosis. The illness was slow, painful, and incurable. For Marie Antoinette, a devoted and affectionate mother, the illness was consuming. She spent endless hours by his bedside, reading, soothing, and praying, her world shrinking to the confines of the nursery. Louis XVI, heartbroken and helpless, similarly retreated, finding solace only in religious observance and isolating himself further from the crushing problems of the state. This personal crisis was a tragic diversion. The mother and father of France, at the very moment the nation was hurtling toward bankruptcy and revolution, were emotionally paralyzed by the imminent death of their heir. The Dauphin eventually died in June 1789, just weeks before the storming of the Bastille. The period of mourning further isolated the king and queen from the populace, who, consumed by the bread crisis and the political struggle, found no emotional sympathy for the tragedy of their indifferent monarchs. The final alarm, the Estates General. The political deadlock and the failure of 2 finance ministers left Louis XVI with only one option: the desperate, historically loaded move of summoning the Estates General, the ancient representative assembly of the nobility, clergy, and the Third Estate, which had not met since 1614. The Queen, demonstrating her final, most potent act of pre-revolutionary foresight, strongly objected to the move. She understood the inherent danger. Calling the Estates General was an admission that the monarchy had lost its absolute power, and it risked unleashing social and political forces that could not be controlled. She feared the voice of the common man, once given a stage, would turn into a revolutionary roar. Yet her voice was overridden by the desperate advice of the king's remaining ministers and the overwhelming pressure from the parliaments and the nobility, who believed they could control the outcome. Louis XVI capitulated, scheduling the Estates General for May 1789. The summoning of the Estates General was the final, tragic failure of the king's will and the ultimate validation of the Queen's warnings. Marie Antoinette's heartbreak in this period was total. She was forced to watch, powerless, as her husband made the one political decision she knew would lead to their ruin. Her quiet alarms, the warnings against the nobility's arrogance, the urging of decisive action, the fear of giving the masses political power were all tragically ignored. Her reputation, born of frivolity and perpetuated by malice, had rendered her foresight utterly irrelevant. She was the one royal in Versailles who understood the peril, yet she was the one voice no one, neither the king nor the people, would trust.
An attempt to broker peace with a faltering nation. The summoning of the Estates General in May 1789, the Queen's final political fear, quickly devolved into catastrophic reality. Within weeks, the Third Estate had declared itself the National Assembly.
The Bastille had fallen in July, and the royal family was forcibly moved from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, now virtual prisoners of the revolutionary mob. The monarchy had been stripped of its political authority and its physical freedom. In this climate of utter defeat, a new, desperate strategy emerged, driven primarily by the sharp, survivalist instinct of Marie Antoinette. The king, emotionally and politically paralyzed, continued to pray and retreat, but the queen recognized that if the crown were to survive, it could no longer fight the revolution, it had to buy it. The unlikely broker, Mirabeau. The only figure powerful and brilliant enough to broker a deal between the monarchy and the National Assembly was Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau. Mirabeau was a towering paradox. His face, scarred by smallpox and framed by a magnificent, wild mane of hair, was notoriously ugly, yet his voice was magnificent, the most powerful orator in the assembly. He was a revolutionary firebrand, a man of staggering personal debt, a known libertine, and a former prisoner. To the queen, he was a monster, the very embodiment of the radical, corrupt element she despised. Yet, despite his revolutionary fervor, Mirabeau was fundamentally a monarchist. He believed that France needed a strong constitutional king to avoid anarchy. He feared the descent into republican chaos far more than he desired the queen's downfall. He was a champion of the people, but not of the mob. This duality made him the only possible bridge between the Tuileries Palace and the National Assembly. In 1790, a secret channel was opened. Marie Antoinette, overriding the king's disgust, took the lead in the negotiations. The arrangement was simple, cynical, and desperate. The crown would secretly pay Mirabeau an enormous sum to settle his debts and a monthly salary thereafter, in exchange for his political intelligence, his public defense of the monarchy in the assembly, and, most crucially, his strategic counsel. The core of the warning: leave Paris. For nearly a year, Mirabeau acted as the crown's secret consultant, providing a constant stream of brilliant, clear-eyed political memoranda, the substance of the warning. His advice was consistent, comprehensive, and brutally honest about the political realities. 1. Embrace the Constitution. The king must stop resisting the initial gains of the revolution. He must sincerely and publicly accept the role of a constitutional monarch, not a reluctant absolute sovereign. He must become the king of the French, not the king of France. 2. Leave the captivity. This was Mirabeau's most urgent and consistent warning. The royal family must leave Paris. Mirabeau argued that the king's will was not free as long as he resided in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by the revolutionary Parisian mob and the radical press. Every act of concession he made was seen as forced, every act of resistance as treasonous. The king could only negotiate from a position of strength, and that required physical freedom. Mirabeau proposed that the royal family should secretly relocate to a strong, loyal provincial city, such as Rouen in Normandy, which possessed a pro-monarchy garrison and was safe from Parisian influence. From there, the king could issue a manifesto appealing directly to the entire nation, not just Paris, for support, and negotiate the terms of a new constitution without fear of being lynched. This move, Mirabeau promised, was the only way to save the crown from the radical tide. The failure of trust and will. The tragic irony of this last chance was that the monarchy paid for the advice, but refused to trust the messenger. Marie Antoinette, despite initiating the contract, remained deeply suspicious of Mirabeau. She respected his intellect. She remarked, "Only the king has a man of genius for an advisor, but he has the head of an ugly man, and he is a monster." But she could never reconcile herself to the immorality of his personal life or the radicalism of his past. She saw him less as a savior and more as a clever, necessary blackmailer. This deep-seated contempt prevented her from fully committing to his radical plan. The king was equally paralyzed. He was appalled by the idea of fleeing Paris like a thief, and deeply reluctant to break entirely with the traditions of absolute monarchy. He viewed the proposed move to Rouen not as a strategic repositioning, but as an act of civil war, which his conscience forbade. He preferred the dignified, passive suffering of captivity in the Tuileries Palace to the decisive, dangerous action Mirabeau demanded. The king and queen procrastinated. They endlessly discussed Mirabeau's plans, but they could not muster the courage or the necessary political will to execute them. They clung to the hope that time or foreign intervention would somehow resolve the crisis without them having to make such a profound and frightening choice. They failed to realize that every passing day strengthened the National Assembly and weakened the crown.
The death of the last hope. Mirabeau, ravaged by a life of excess and the relentless strain of his double-dealing, was a man living on borrowed time. On April 2, 1791, he died suddenly and dramatically, worn out by his own genius and the impossible task of bridging two irreconcilable political worlds. The public reaction was immense. The Assembly mourned him as a hero of the Revolution, interring him in the newly consecrated Pantheon. His death, however, was a devastating blow to the monarchy, a catastrophe far greater than any of the early military defeats. Mirabeau's council, for all its cost and controversy, had provided the crown with its only viable roadmap for survival. His death removed the only political heavyweight capable of controlling the Assembly, and the only voice the king and queen had been reluctantly willing to pay to hear. With Mirabeau gone, the strategic vacuum was filled not by cool reason, but by the queen's desperation and the king's despair. They chose to ignore the sophisticated advice of the dead orator and listened instead to the desperate, ill-conceived plans of their own loyal but politically inept courtiers. Just 2 months after the death of the only man who had warned them to leave Paris with dignity, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette prepared for their own unadvised, desperate, and ultimately fatal escape, the flight to Varennes. The warning was silenced, and the precipice of ruin was now clearly visible. Part 4. The Revolution Consumes. The March to Versailles, the end of opulence and the beginning of fear. By October 19, 1789, the French Revolution was 4 months old, yet the symbols of monarchical power, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, resided in the gilded sanctuary of Versailles, 20 kilometers from the volatile heart of Paris. The king and queen remained aloof, relying on the palace's ancient sanctity to shield them from the chaos that had erupted with the fall of the Bastille. This distance, once a comfort, had become a political fault line. The atmosphere was toxic, charged by 2 potent, unforgiving forces: the perpetual hunger of the Parisian populace and the political resentment against the crown's perceived resistance to the new National Assembly. A severe bread shortage, the direct legacy of the previous year's poor harvest, and the myth of "let them eat cake," turned Paris into a tinderbox. The stage was set for the people to physically bridge the gap between their starving reality and the monarchy's opulent detachment. The insult and the spark. The immediate catalyst for the storm was an act of perceived royal hubris. On October 1st, the king's royal bodyguard hosted a banquet for the newly arrived Flanders Regiment in the Versailles Opera House. It was a boisterous, drunken affair, meant to celebrate loyalty. When the royal family made a brief appearance, the already raucous soldiers toasted the king and queen with fanatical devotion. The final, fatal act was the reported desecration of the national cockade. Drunken officers allegedly stamped on the revolutionary tricolor cockade, the red, white, and blue symbol of the nation, replacing it with the white Bourbon cockade or the black Austrian one representing the Queen.
News of this event, magnified by the revolutionary press, reached the hungry, tense streets of Paris within 24 hours. It was interpreted not as a private display of loyalty, but as a deliberate, treasonous royal insult to the nation and a declaration of counter-revolution. The people believed the king was planning to use the newly arrived troops to dissolve the National Assembly, and that the queen was once again the driving force behind the conspiracy. The time for political debate was over. The time for direct, physical action had arrived. The March to the Market Women. The mobilization began before dawn on October 5th. It was a spontaneously organized event, spearheaded by the women of the central Parisian markets, the poissardes, whose daily lives revolved around the price of flour. Driven by a simple primal demand, bread, and armed with knives, pikes, and muskets seized from the city armory, thousands of women began marching the 20 kilometers towards Versailles. The sheer audacity of the movement was stunning. These were not abstract revolutionaries, but the mothers, wives, and workers of Paris, marching in the pouring rain, dragging cannons they had stolen, their voices hoarse with political rage and physical hunger. Their political demand was as clear as their need for sustenance. They demanded the king return to Paris. They were convinced that only by having the baker, Louis XVI, and the baker's wife, Marie Antoinette, under the watchful eye of the people, could the supply of bread be assured. The king, they believed, was too kind to starve them, and the queen was too wicked to be trusted. The Night of Terror, the end of opulence and the beginning of fear. By late afternoon, thousands of rain-soaked, mud-splattered market women stood massed outside the glistening golden gates of Versailles, the symbolic confrontation of Parisian poverty with royal opulence. The initial hours were chaotic but controlled. A small delegation of women was admitted to speak with the king, who, as ever the kind man, promised to address the bread shortage and approve the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But the crowd was too vast, and its intentions too volatile to be satisfied with mere promises. The situation became critical with the belated arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette, the popular commander of the National Guard, who marched thousands of troops from Paris. Lafayette, believing he had secured the safety of the royal family by midnight, assured the king that the danger was contained. This was a catastrophic misjudgment. In the pre-dawn hours of October 6th, small groups of enraged, desperate citizens found an unguarded gate and breached the palace. The end of opulence began in a horrifying scene of violence. The mob swarmed the inner courtyards, demanding to find the queen. They broke into the queen's apartments, forcing her bodyguard, Moignandre de Sainte-Marie, to defend her door. He was struck down and murdered, his head later removed. Marie Antoinette, awakened by the screams and the sound of axes crashing against her door, fled her bedchamber in her nightclothes. Guided by the piercing cries of her ladies-in-waiting, she ran through a hidden passage linking her room to the king's, narrowly escaping the mob that was already slashing her mattress and breaking her furniture. The sanctity of the monarchy was destroyed. The palace, the ultimate symbol of Bourbon power, was defiled with the blood of its defenders. The balcony and the procession of shame. The crisis reached its climax when Lafayette finally regained control of the palace. The mob demanded to see the king. Louis XVI appeared on the balcony, promising to move his family to Paris. But the crowd, still baying for the queen, demanded she appear as well. Marie Antoinette hesitated, knowing this was likely her death sentence. Taking the hands of her children, she prepared to face them. Lafayette, with a sudden flash of inspiration, urged her to appear alone. The queen, displaying a raw, magnificent courage that astonished both her enemies and allies, stepped onto the balcony. Dressed simply in a white nightgown, she stood silent and motionless, facing the thousands of armed, murderous Parisians below. Her poise was devastating. For a few stunned seconds, the mob fell silent.
Lafayette, attempting to defuse the situation, dramatically kissed her hand. The act momentarily broke the bloodlust. The king formally announced his agreement. "My friends, I will go to Paris with my wife and my children." The return journey was a 6-hour-long torturous procession of shame. The immense column, estimated at 60,000 people, was led by the women and the National Guard, followed by the king and queen's carriage, surrounded by the mob. The heads of the murdered guards were impaled on pikes and held aloft. The crowd, now jubilant and terrifying, chanted, "We have the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. We will no longer starve." Versailles was abandoned. The royal family was delivered to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a dilapidated, half-finished former royal residence that lacked the sanctity and security of Versailles. They were prisoners, and Marie Antoinette had exchanged the opulence of her golden cage for the chilling beginning of fear in the heart of the revolutionary city. The revolution had consumed the symbols of its power, and there was no going back. A desperate gambit for liberty lost. Following their forced relocation in October 1789, the Tuileries Palace became, for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, a magnificent, suffocating prison. They were surrounded by the hostile National Guard and the omnipresent threat of the Parisian mob. The king, convinced that the oaths he had sworn to the new constitution were invalid because they were extracted under duress, privately resolved that he could only reign as an absolute monarch. To continue pretending to rule while captive was a lie. To reclaim his throne, he required physical liberty. With the death of Mirabeau in April 1791, the monarchy lost its last, best hope of achieving a constitutional compromise. The king and queen, desperate and politically blind, decided to follow the strategy Mirabeau had urged, but without his counsel or control: flight. The destination was Montmedy, a royalist garrison near the Austria-Netherlands border, where they intended to re-establish royal sovereignty and negotiate a new constitution from a position of strength. The emotional driving force behind the plan was Count Axel von Fersen, the architect of escape, Fersen's loyalty. Axel von Fersen's devotion to Marie Antoinette had deepened during their captivity. He saw the Queen's anguish and Louis XVI's paralysis, and his loyalty transcended mere courtly affection. It became a consuming, all-encompassing commitment to save the woman he loved. Fersen was the architect of the escape, planning the logistics with meticulous military precision, spending weeks secretly acquiring horses, recruiting loyal guards, and establishing the relay posts along the eastern route. Yet the plan was fatally flawed, ruined by the very arrogance and entitlement it sought to escape. Fersen, with a sound grasp of strategy, argued for 2 small, fast, unostentatious English coaches. The king, however, insisted on traveling en masse and in comfort. The result was the construction of the infamous berline, a massive, custom-built carriage, heavy, slow, bright yellow, and equipped with a full kitchen, a large trunk, and all the accoutrements necessary for a comfortable royal journey. It was utterly conspicuous, easily recognizable, and ruinously slow. The king also insisted on traveling with the entire immediate family: himself, the queen, their 2 children, the young Dauphin and Madame Royale, and Madame Elisabeth, the king's loyal sister. This insistence on maintaining the royal core and comfort over speed and security was the first fatal error that doomed the gambit for liberty. The night of the Great Escape. The attempt was launched on the night of June 20th, 1791. The plan required the royal family to leave the Tuileries Palace sequentially and in disguise. The tension within the palace was unbearable. The queen, disguised as a Russian baroness, Madame de Korff, the king as her valet, Monsieur Dorin, and the Dauphin dressed in girls' clothes, slipped out of their quarters one by one. There were terrifying close calls. The king stumbled. The queen nearly walked into the patrol of the Marquis de Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, who was conducting his final rounds. And the children were nearly lost in the dark courtyard. Furzin, driving a humble hackney carriage, waited outside the palace walls. The sequential pickups were executed with agonizing slowness. Finally, the entire family was transferred to the enormous berlin waiting on the outskirts of Paris, and Furzin, taking the reins, drove them onto the road toward Bondy. At Bondy, Furzin executed his final, heartbreaking act of loyalty. He transferred the king to the care of the armed escorts, and with a final, tearful farewell to the queen, watched the heavy berlin lumber off into the darkness. He rode in the opposite direction, hoping to throw any initial pursuit off the scent. Marie Antoinette never saw the man who risked everything for her again. Delays and the fatal recognition. The berlin, true to its design, immediately began to fall behind schedule. The weight of the carriage and the poor state of the roads meant that the royal party was delayed by several critical hours. The king, perhaps out of habit or sheer fatigue, worsened the situation by insisting on stopping to chat with the escorts and locals, occasionally leaning out of the window to observe the crowd, a disastrous move for a man supposedly disguised as a valet. The delays threw the intricate plan into utter chaos. The armed escorts, meant to meet the carriage at precise points, waited for hours, assumed the mission was aborted, and dispersed, leaving crucial stretches of the road unguarded. The fatal moment of recognition occurred on the evening of June 21st in the small town of Saint-Manoul. The carriage was delayed while changing horses. The postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, a zealous revolutionary, stared intently at the king's face peering from the window. He was struck by a powerful resemblance to the portrait of the king printed on the revolutionary currency, the assignat. Convinced of the identity of the travelers, he did not sound the alarm immediately. Instead, as the heavy carriage lumbered out of town, he mounted his fastest horse and rode furiously to the next staging point, Varennes. The berlin arrived in Varennes in Argonne late that night, hours behind schedule. In a final, disastrous logistical blunder, the escort meant to meet them was waiting at the wrong end of the town. The king, weary and indecisive, refused to push forward. He hesitated, sending his servant to search for the escort, precious minutes slipping away. Meanwhile, Drouet, having ridden cross-country with ferocious speed, arrived at Varennes and sounded the alarm. The town quickly awoke. Drouet and the local revolutionary officials barricaded the bridge, the only escape route out of Varennes, with furniture and wagons. When the royal family finally realized their peril, they were trapped. The local officials, led by the procureur of the town, entered the royal apartment above a grocer's shop. The king, tired and defeated, confessed his identity. He attempted to appeal to the officials, offering them bribes and titles, but they politely refused, stating their duty was to the nation. Louis XVI finally lost his will to resist. When he failed to issue the necessary orders to the few loyal escorts who remained, the final opportunity for armed resistance and escape vanished. The gambit for liberty was lost. The traitors return. The return journey to Paris was an endless 3-day nightmare. The royal family was escorted by tens of thousands of armed, silent, contemptuous citizens who lined the roads. No hats were doffed, no cheers were raised. The journey was marked by a chilling, profound silence. the silence of an entire nation that no longer recognized its king. The royal carriage was soon joined by revolutionary commissioners, including the radical Antoine Barnave, who found himself deeply moved by the Queen's dignity and the plight of the children. The return was the final devastating humiliation. The king was no longer seen as a sacred, if misguided sovereign, but as a traitorous deserter who had attempted to abandon his people and lead a foreign invasion. The monarchy, which had relied for 1,000 years on the sacred bond between ruler and ruled, had irreparably broken that trust. The flight to Varennes did not destroy the king's life, but it destroyed the crown's legitimacy, guaranteeing the eventual death of both. The ultimate heartbreak was the Queen's realization that the devotion of one man, Furzin, could not overcome the hatred of an entire nation.
The shocking reality of defeat. The year 1792 was the year the French monarchy was finally and violently extinguished. Following the catastrophic failure of the flight to Varennes, the royal family was confined to the Tuileries, where they endured the humiliating daily charade of a constitutional monarchy. But that charade ended on August 10, 1792, when a massive, armed Parisian mob and revolutionary fédérés stormed the palace. The Swiss Guard was massacred, and the king, terrified and indecisive, led his family to seek refuge in the nearby National Assembly. This was the monarchy's final political surrender. The Assembly, now controlled by radical factions, suspended the king, formally ending the 1,000-year rule of the Bourbons. For the next 3 days, the royal family was held in the cramped, fetid lodge of the Assembly, subjected to the taunts of the galleries and the endless debate over their future. The decision was swiftly rendered. They would be imprisoned in the Temple Tower. The journey to the symbol of defeat. On the evening of August 13, 1792, the royal family was driven through the vengeful, hostile streets of Paris toward their final confinement. The Temple Fortress, a massive, isolated medieval compound originally built by the Knights Templar, was chosen for its grim symbolism and impregnable walls. It was a dark, square keep, a relic of the feudal past, now being repurposed to bury the final remnants of the monarchy. The arrival was a moment of profound, sickening realization. They were escorted into the main tower, a damp, cold, 4-story building that smelled of stone and neglect. The family, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their children, Marie-Thérèse and the young Dauphin, and Madame Elizabeth, were directed to the upper floors, their new apartments. The shock was absolute. This was not the gilded captivity of the Tuileries, where even under guard, the illusion of royal life could be maintained. This was a prison. The windows were bricked up, leaving only small apertures for light. The walls were thick, damp, and moldy, and the furniture was coarse and scarce. They were stripped of their servants, their elaborate wardrobes, and nearly all their personal effects. The shocking reality of defeat was immediate and physical. They were no longer king and queen, but common prisoners. The unbearable scrutiny. Life inside the Temple Tower was defined by relentless, humiliating surveillance. The revolutionary commune was determined to demonstrate that the former sovereigns were no better than ordinary citizens, and often far worse. Their guards were hand-picked from the most zealous sections of the National Guard and the local Parisian commune, often crude, uneducated men who took sadistic pleasure in the royal family's downfall.
The guards were instructed never to leave the family alone, creating a climate of total intrusion. They would sit at the family's dinner table, smoke cigars in Louis XVI's face, sing lewd revolutionary songs about the Queen, and deliberately use crude, familiar language to demean them. Marie Antoinette, in particular, was the target of focused hatred. Guards would draw scandalous pictures of her on the walls and doors, forcing the children to look. She was denied basic privacy for bathing and changing. The very acts of eating, sleeping, and teaching their children were performed under the cold, critical, and often vulgar gaze of their jailers. This humiliating reality broke Louis XVI first. Though he maintained a quiet dignity, he often retreated into prayer and stoicism. For Marie Antoinette, however, the adversity triggered the final, most dignified stage of her maturity. The frivolous queen had died at Varennes. The magnificent mother emerged in the temple. The queen's final strength. Marie Antoinette's priority in the temple was singularly focused, the preservation of her family's moral integrity. She became the emotional rock of the family, organizing their days with meticulous routine, lessons for the children, reading, and simple games. She focused on distracting the young Dauphin from the terrible reality of their captivity. She wore a simple dress of black crepe, symbolic of perpetual mourning for the monarchy itself. Her beauty faded rapidly. Her famous blonde hair turned stark white due to the constant stress. Yet in her adversity, she achieved the dignity that had eluded her in her years of power. She faced the guards' rudeness with a quiet, icy politeness, refusing to descend to their level. She taught her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, to maintain her composure and to endure the indignities with silence. The true heartbreak of this period was the absolute isolation. Count Fersen, desperate to help, risked his life to send a few coded messages, confirming his devotion and attempting to convey outside news. The Queen treasured these tiny, fragile links to the outside world, but they were rare and offered no hope of physical rescue. Her former friends and allies, terrified for their own lives, were silent. Separation and the king's execution. The most devastating political act of the revolution occurred while the family was imprisoned. In December 1992, the king was forcibly separated from his family and moved to the lower floor of the temple. The pretext was his upcoming trial. The real reason was to begin the final, agonizing process of psychological destruction. Marie Antoinette collapsed, weeping and raging against the separation. Yet she quickly regained her composure. The king was no longer a symbol of power, but simply her husband, and she was now utterly focused on his trial, clinging to the vain hope of his acquittal. The king was tried by the convention, who convicted him of treason and sentenced him to death. On the evening of January 20th, 1793, the family was granted a final, heartbreaking farewell in the king's apartment. The scene was one of overwhelming grief, the children clinging to their father, Marie Antoinette and Madame Elizabeth sobbing uncontrollably. Louis XVI, having confessed and consoled his family, promised to see them again in the morning. He did not. Louis XVI was executed on January 21, 1793. The sound of cannon fire announcing the execution of the king reached the Tower. Marie Antoinette, now the widow Capet, was left alone with her children and sister-in-law, trapped in the cold, unyielding temple fortress. Her life had been one of political failure and personal scandal. But her final heartbreak had arrived, the violent death of her husband, and the absolute, shocking reality of total defeat. Her destiny was now irreversibly sealed.
A mother's final anguish. Following the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793, the Temple Tower became a mausoleum of broken royal hopes. Marie Antoinette, the widow Capet, was no longer grieving a husband, she was protecting a destiny. Her strength, her very will to live, was now anchored solely in the survival of her two children, Marie-Thérèse, Madame Royale, and Louis Charles, the 8-year-old Dauphin, and her loyal sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. The revolutionary government, now dominated by the radical Jacobins and entering the horrific phase known as the Reign of Terror, understood this anchor perfectly. To extinguish the monarchy completely, they had to dismantle its last living symbol, and that required first breaking the mother. The months that followed Louis XVI's death were marked by a chilling, deliberate strategy of emotional assassination. The shadow of the widowed queen. The widowed Capet's presence was a political liability. Though stripped of her title, she possessed an inner dignity that the coarse surveillance of the guards could not destroy. She continued to organize her small family's day with rigid routine, lessons for the children, prayer, and shared silence, turning their grim prison into a sanctuary of defiance. But the political pressure intensified. France was now at war with almost all of Europe. The coalition saw the young Dauphin as King Louis XVII and his mother as the key to restoring the Bourbon line. For the Jacobins, the family's survival represented a constant threat of counter-revolution. The final act of cruelty would not be immediate execution, but the destruction of the familial bond. The separation from the Dauphin. The first decisive blow came on July 3, 1793. Late that evening, a group of commissioners from the Commune entered the Queen's chamber with a mandate. The child Louis Charles must be separated from his mother and aunt and placed in his own separate room under the care of a revolutionary tutor. Marie Antoinette fought the order with a fierce desperation that shattered her usual composure. She pleaded, argued, and physically blocked the door, clinging to her son with a mother's last primal defense. "You cannot do this," she screamed, facing down the armed men. "He is too young. I will not allow it." The confrontation lasted for nearly 2 hours. The commissioners, brutalized by the revolution, were initially hesitant to use physical force against a woman. But their orders were clear. They threatened to call in the guards to butcher both her and her sister-in-law if she continued to resist. Madame Elizabeth, weeping, urged the Queen to submit to save their lives. Finally, Marie Antoinette knelt, her face a mask of utter devastation, and released her son. She gave Louis Charles a desperate final hug, urging him to never forget God, his father, and his mother. The 8-year-old Dauphin was torn from her arms, carried across the corridor, and locked in his own room. The shock of the separation was total. Marie Antoinette sat in stunned silence for hours, her eyes fixed on the door through which her son had been taken. This was the true moment of a mother's final anguish. Her reason for stoicism, her motivation for daily survival had been ripped away. She could hear the faint sounds of her son from his room, and soon the sounds of his heartbreaking decline. The destruction of Louis XVII. The Commune's strategy for the Dauphin was simple: to destroy him morally, emotionally, and physically, ensuring that the heir to the throne became a broken, corrupted revolutionary puppet. His new tutor was Antoine Simon, a crude alcoholic cobbler from the Parisian sections. Simon's task was to turn the boy against his parents and the aristocracy.
Louis Charles was dressed in rough peasant clothes, beaten, forced to drink wine, and taught obscene revolutionary songs and curses. He was forbidden to pray and constantly questioned about the political secrets of his dead father. The heartbreaking cruelty of this torment was compounded for Marie Antoinette by her proximity. She could often hear her son's panicked cries, his sobs, and sometimes the sounds of Simon's drunken rage and the boy being forced to sing. She was forced to listen to the psychological destruction of her child, powerless to intervene. This auditory torture was the ultimate refinement of her captivity. The final solitude, transfer to the conciergerie. 1 month later, the final surgical cut was made. On the night of August 1st, 1793, the Queen was awakened by the guards. Without warning, they read the decree. She was to be transferred immediately to the conciergerie prison. She was allowed to pack only a small, meager bundle of clothes and a few sentimental items. She begged to say goodbye to her daughter and sister-in-law, but the request was denied. She left Marie-Thérèse, now terrified and alone, behind, knowing this was likely their last physical separation. The conciergerie, located on the Île de la Cité, was infamous as the antechamber to the guillotine. Built on the ruins of the medieval royal palace, it was the final holding place for the most politically sensitive prisoners before their trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal. For Marie Antoinette, it meant that her trial and her inevitable execution were imminent. She was placed in a tiny, dark cell, initially without even a proper bed, where the dampness and mold were constant. The guards, fearing her symbolic power, maintained an even stricter, more intrusive surveillance than in the temple. A gendarme was stationed in her cell at all times, sleeping behind a flimsy screen, ensuring she had no moment of privacy. The terror of the conciergerie was not the physical discomfort, but the absolute solitude. The loss of her husband, the agonizing separation from her son, and now the abrupt final break from her remaining daughter and sister-in-law left her utterly alone. Her heart, already broken countless times by political slander and personal shame, had now been shattered by maternal anguish. Her physical decline was rapid. Constant illness, lack of proper hygiene, and overwhelming grief led to visible emaciation. Yet, in this final state of solitude and defeat, Marie Antoinette achieved a profound, almost saintly dignity. She spent her time mending her remaining clothes and using a pen to etch faint words into the damp wall of her cell, mostly prayers and notes about her children. She never once complained to her guards, refusing to give them the satisfaction of witnessing her despair. Her heartbreak was now complete, hidden entirely beneath a veneer of stoic endurance. She had outlived her husband, her crown, her son's safety, and her closest confidants. She was merely waiting for the final political judgment, a judgment that was a foregone conclusion, but one she would face, not as the frivolous, hated queen, but as a woman who had at last found the unwavering strength of duty and maternal love.
A mother's final anguish in the tower. The transfer from the Temple Tower to the infamous conciergerie on August 2, 1793, severed Marie Antoinette's last connection to her former life and her children. The move, executed in the dead of night, was the final surgical dismantling of the family unit, leaving the widow Capet in a state of profound, absolute solitude. She had exchanged the dim, shared grief of the temple for the cold, unyielding finality of a solitary stone cell. The conciergerie was aptly nicknamed the antechamber to the guillotine, the final transit point for the politically damned.
Its atmosphere was thick with the terror of the imminent death sentences being handed down by the Revolutionary Tribunal. Here, Marie Antoinette, once the most celebrated and reviled woman in Europe, became merely prisoner number 280, living only to wait for the cart. The Fortress of Isolation. Her cell was small, damp, and perpetually shadowed, a former guard room with walls thick enough to silence any hope of hearing the outside world. The furniture was minimal, a coarse bed, a simple chair, and a table. The conditions were stark, designed to erode the spirit, but the true burden was the relentless surveillance. A gendarme was stationed in her cell 24 hours a day, separated from her only by a flimsy, ill-fitting screen. This intrusion was a deliberate psychological torment, denying her any moment of privacy for prayer, thought, or tears. She could not change her clothes, attend to her personal hygiene, or mourn her husband and son without the cold, judgmental gaze of her revolutionary jailer. This enforced intimacy with an enemy magnified her solitude. She could not speak her mind, write her feelings, or allow the mask of dignity to slip. Her world, once filled with the glittering chaos of Versailles, was now compressed to a few square feet of moldy stone and the suffocating presence of one hostile man. Her physical decline accelerated rapidly. Chronic hemorrhage and lack of proper sanitation plagued her. She could barely walk, and her famous hair, already white, was thin and lank. Yet it was in this state of ultimate physical degradation that her inner dignity became most luminous. She possessed nothing but her composure, and she clung to it with the ferocity of a royal who understood that silent defiance was the last weapon against tyranny. The maternal anguish, sound and silence. The profoundest element of her solitude was the emotional knowledge of her children's suffering. Her son, the young Louis Charles, was suffering a deliberate moral and physical destruction in his separate room in the temple, less than a mile away. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, was now alone with her aunt, bearing the weight of the family tragedy. In the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette's only contact with her daughter came through the silence of her new cell. She no longer heard the faint, terrifying cries of her son that had haunted her in the temple. She lived for scraps of news, which were deliberately withheld or delivered with malicious intent. The anguish was exacerbated by the memory of her final desperate embrace with Louis Charles and the knowledge that every day her son spent with the vicious cobbler Simon was another day his innocence was eroded and his love for her was poisoned. Her maternal love, which had finally brought meaning to her reign, was now the source of her deepest, most continuous pain. The political decision and the indictment. By October 1793, the Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Robespierre, decided that the time for the widow Capet's trial had come. It was no longer necessary to hold her as a bargaining chip. She was an impediment to the radical republic. Her death was deemed politically essential to crush royalist opposition and eliminate the last symbol of the Ancien regime. The trial, set for October 14th, was to be a propaganda exercise, not a genuine pursuit of justice. The charges were comprehensive, vicious, and designed to strip her of any remaining shred of humanity. 1. Treason. Conspiring with foreign powers, Austria and the European coalition, to wage war against the French nation. 2. Extravagance. Being the source of the national debt, the Madame Deficit charge. 3. Moral corruption, introducing a system of dissolute habits and corrupting the morals of the court. These accusations were old, expected, and easily refuted with quiet dignity. But the prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, reserved his final, most devastating psychological attack for the court itself. The final assault, the incest charge. During the indictment,
Fouquier Tinville introduced the testimony of her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, who had been coerced and intoxicated by the cobbler Simon to sign a statement detailing incestuous relations with his mother and aunt. This was the ultimate, most malicious blow against Marie Antoinette's character, a direct, unforgivable assault on her maternal integrity, the one virtue she had worked tirelessly to earn in her final years. The courtroom, seasoned in revolutionary rhetoric and violence, gasped in shock at the grotesque nature of the charge. For a moment, Marie Antoinette, the stoic queen who had faced the murder of her guards and the execution of her husband without a public tremor, broke. She was silent, but her face was flooded with a terrifying crimson shame. When the judge demanded her answer, she turned to the audience, ignoring the tribunal. "I have not answered because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present in this room." This powerful, spontaneous appeal, the only emotional outburst of her entire trial, shifted the atmosphere, forcing a momentary wave of sympathy from the women in the gallery. It was a final, desperate act of the mother rising above the queen, refuting the political lie with the undeniable truth of biology and human emotion. The dignity of defeat. Having withstood the final, most wicked assault, Marie Antoinette regained her composure. The solitude and anguish of the conciergerie were designed to break her, but in the end, they tempered her. Stripped of the trappings of royalty, she found her ultimate strength, the quiet, enduring dignity of a woman facing an unjust death. She was not the frivolous queen on trial. She was the defiant mother, and her heartbroken courage was her final public legacy.
Dignity in the face of the guillotine. The weeks Marie Antoinette spent in the damp, confining walls of the conciergerie stripped her of everything: her power, her family, and her name. But the solitude, rather than crushing her spirit, had hardened her resolve. By the time her trial was called on October 14, 1793, she was no longer the frivolous, defensive Dauphine. She was the widow Capet, a woman prepared to meet her fate with an internal fortitude that the revolution could not touch. The trial was not about establishing guilt, but about staging a public execution. It was a required piece of political theater, designed to destroy the monarchy's last living symbol and terrify its remaining loyalists. The courtroom was packed with armed guards and zealots, and the political atmosphere was venomous. The appearance before the tribunal. When Marie Antoinette was led from her cell and presented before the revolutionary tribunal, the crowd strained to see her. They expected the arrogant, glittering queen of the Ancien Régime. Instead, they saw a woman of profound and tragic decline. She was dressed in a simple, faded black dress, worn and thin. Her face was pale and drawn, bearing the indelible marks of grief and sickness, and her hair was stark white. Yet, as she fixed her gaze upon the prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, she exuded a chilling, unwavering composure. Her dignity was not theatrical. It was the quiet resilience of a soul that had endured every possible humiliation and found nothing left to fear. The presiding judge, Armand Martial Herman, opened the proceedings, framing the trial not as a personal matter, but as the inevitable confrontation between a free republic and a tyrannical monarchy. The charges were read, a venomous synthesis of 2 decades of slander: treason, squandering the national treasury, the Madame Deficit charge, and moral corruption. The parade of false witnesses. The trial lasted 2 days, consisting of a relentless parade of witnesses whose testimony was either hearsay, political conjecture, or outright malicious fabrication. The prosecution called 30 witnesses, each adding a new layer to the caricature of the queen. The finances.
Former royal officials testified to the massive, undeniable cost of her luxuries, though failing to separate her personal spending from the vast pre-existing debts of the French state. The politics. Witnesses repeated old rumors about her lobbying Louis XVI on behalf of her brother, Emperor Joseph II, cementing the Austrian spy narrative. The frivolity. The Queen was forced to listen to detailed accounts of her late-night gambling, her passion for masks, and the influence over the fashion of the era, all presented as high crimes against the Republic's virtue. She responded to these charges with quiet indifference, seeing them for the ridiculous slanders they were. Her defense lawyers, appointed hastily and given barely an hour to review the massive indictment, could do little more than plead for mercy and point out the lack of concrete evidence of conspiracy. The trial's result was sealed the moment the accusation of treason was leveled. The incest charge, the final assault. The turning point of the trial, the moment the proceedings descended into pure political savagery, came with the testimony of Jacques Hébert, the editor of the radical newspaper Le Père Duchesne. He read the coerced signed testimony of the young Dauphin, Louis Charles, alleging grotesque incestuous acts between the boy, his mother, and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even the hardened political fanatics were momentarily shocked by the sheer vulgarity and extremity of the lie. Marie Antoinette, until this point stoic and reserved, finally cracked. Her composure failed her. She arose, her face red with burning shame, and addressed not the judge, but the female citizens in the gallery. "I have not answered, because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present in this room." This was her final, devastating act of defiance. By appealing to the universal bond of motherhood, she shattered the political facade of the trial, forcing a brief, undeniable flicker of sympathy from the women in the audience. She refused to dignify the charge with a rebuttal, knowing that to discuss it was to accept its premise. Her dignity had found its most powerful defense in the simple, heartbreaking truth of her maternal identity. The verdict and the Last Supper. The trial concluded late on the night of October 15th. The jury, comprised of men dedicated to the overthrow of the monarchy, took little time to deliberate. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts, including high treason and depleting the nation's wealth. Marie Antoinette received the sentence with icy calm. She was immediately returned to her cell in the conciergerie. There, under the cold watch of the gendarme, she performed her final, most intimate duties. She wrote her final, poignant letter to Madame Elizabeth, her beloved sister-in-law, who was still imprisoned in the Temple and would be executed 6 months later. The letter was a testament to her faith, her stoicism, and her profound forgiveness. She wrote, "I write to you for the last time. I have just been condemned not to a shameful death, for it is so only for criminals, but to join your brother." She asked Elizabeth to forgive those who were causing their deaths, and urged her to care for the children. She wrote that she was calm and firm, upheld by the belief that she was joining the husband and the mother she had loved. She attempted to write a final private farewell to her daughter, Marie Thérèse, but her handwriting was shaky and she fell into a final, exhausted sleep. The Final Journey, October 16th, 1793. The morning of October 16th was cold and foggy. At 5 a.m., the executioner, Henri Sanson, entered her cell. He cut her white hair short, a common practice to keep it from fouling the guillotine blade. She was then forced to change out of her black mourning dress, into a simple white cotton shift, the color of widows and women condemned to death. Her hands were bound behind her back with coarse rope. At 11 a.m. she was led out to the waiting execution cart. This was not the gilded carriage of Versailles, but a rough, open common cart reserved for ordinary criminals. She was placed facing backwards beside the revolutionary priest, who she had refused, saying she wished no comfort from a man who had sworn allegiance to the Republic. The proceeding took the long route through the heart of Paris. Marie Antoinette, pale but composed, sat exposed to the full, vengeful fury of the Parisian mob. The crowds were enormous, jeering and shouting, "Death to the Austrian," and "Madame Deficit." For 2 hours she endured the ultimate public humiliation. She gazed straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with the mob, her pale, dignified profile standing in contrast to the hatred swirling around her. When the cart reached the Place de Révolution, she ascended the steps of the scaffold with a firm, steady grace. Her last act was one of accidental courtesy. She stumbled slightly and stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last recorded words were an apology. "Monsieur, I beg your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." Moments later, the Queen's head was severed. The executioner held it aloft, displaying it to the roar of the crowd. The widow Capet had found the dignity that had eluded the frivolous Dauphine. In the face of the guillotine, she offered silence, forgiveness, and the quiet, unyielding dignity of a woman who had finally found peace in defeat. The revolution killed the Queen, but it had created the martyr.
From martyr to mythmaker, and the truth in between. On October 16, 1793, the moment the executioner held the head of Marie Antoinette aloft, the French Revolution achieved a symbolic victory far greater than any battlefield triumph. It had eliminated the living symbol of the Ancien Régime. The revolutionary aim was simple: erasure. The Queen's body was hastily carted away and dumped into an unmarked mass grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, unceremoniously covered with quicklime. The intention was to crush her memory beneath the soil of the new republic. But the revolution failed. In killing Marie Antoinette, it did not achieve erasure, it achieved immortality. The woman who had been universally reviled in her final years was instantly transformed into a powerful, polarizing symbol, her legacy dividing into two irreconcilable political myths that persist to this day. The martyrdom effect, the counter-revolution's rallying cry. The dignified composure Marie Antoinette displayed on the scaffold was not the end of her political life, but the beginning of her afterlife as a martyr. Her quiet strength in the face of the malicious incest charge and her final, humble resignation astonished observers and immediately backfired on the revolutionary cause. Across Europe, the regicides solidified the resolve of the royalist coalitions against France. The Queen's death, coupled with the continued brutal imprisonment of her children, especially the suffering of the young Louis XVII, who would die wretchedly in the Temple Tower, served as undeniable proof of the revolution's moral corruption and inhumanity. Marie Antoinette's final letter to Madame Elizabeth, a testament to forgiveness and faith, was smuggled out and circulated among royalists, painting her as a Catholic saint and a victim of revolutionary barbarity. She became the perfect rallying cry, a vulnerable, tragic woman executed by a monstrous republic. The émigrés and royalists abandoned the political bickering that had characterized the Ancien Régime and united behind the image of the martyred queen. This martyrdom effect sustained the counter-revolutionary movement for decades, ensuring that the return of the Bourbon, the Restoration, remained a fixed political goal.
Her death, intended to finalize the Republic, instead provided the fuel for its political opposition. The mythmaker, the necessity of the villain. While royalists constructed the myth of the martyr, the Republic cemented the opposing myth, that of the mythmaker, the central, necessary villain. The revolutionaries could not simply say they executed a frivolous, politically inept woman. To justify the regicide, they needed to believe they had executed a tyrannical, malicious monster. The myths fostered by the libelles, Madame Deficit, the Austrian spy, the incestuous queen, were not merely slanders. They became essential political truths that provided the moral legitimacy for the terror. Marie Antoinette's image was inflated to mythical proportions. She was portrayed as the single-handed cause of France's economic ruin, the puppet master pulling the strings of the weak Louis XVI, and the ultimate symbol of aristocratic decay. The enduring power of this myth lies in its simplicity. It offered the French people a single, easily identifiable target for complex socio-economic failures. Even after the fall of the monarchy, Republican historians continued to propagate the image of the extravagant, heartless foreigner to legitimize the foundation of the Republic. The "let them eat cake" myth, though disproven countless times, remains the most powerful artifact of this necessity, a simple, venomous lie that defined a truth greater than the woman herself. The truth in between. Flawed humanity. The true heartbreak of Marie Antoinette's legacy lies in the search for the truth in between the martyr and the mythmaker. The historical woman was neither the devil of the Republican press nor the saint of the royalist pamphlets. She was, in essence, a profoundly misunderstood human being caught in a historical catastrophe. 1. The frivolous girl. She was indeed frivolous, extravagant, and often politically blind in her youth. Her spending was reckless, her reliance on favorites was unwise, and her resistance to French customs was arrogant. Her profound early immaturity and her inability to grasp the difference between the public gaze and private life were her greatest political failings. 2. The isolated woman. Her extravagance was driven by a deep psychological need to fill the void left by an unconsummated, unloving marriage and the crushing isolation of Versailles. Her search for love led her to Fersen and her confidence, acts that were personal but had devastating political consequences. 3. The redeemed mother. Her final years were characterized by genuine maturity, deep maternal love, and a clear-eyed, if late, political foresight. She died with a personal dignity and moral clarity that was utterly lacking in her years of power. Her ultimate tragedy was being placed in a role that demanded extraordinary political acumen at the precise moment French society was fundamentally fracturing. She was the wrong person, born at the worst time, forced to defend a system she barely understood against forces no one could control. She was judged by the standards of a republic while living under the law of absolute monarchy. Restoration and final peace. The two political myths continued to battle for 20 years until the fall of Napoleon. With the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1815, Louis XVIII, Louis XVI's surviving brother, sought to finalize the martyrdom narrative. In a powerful symbolic gesture, Louis XVIII ordered the exhumation of the bodies of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from the Madeleine Cemetery. Their remains were formally identified, the Queen by the garter and fragments of her clothing, and transferred in a solemn, elaborate procession to the royal necropolis at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. They were interred beside the kings and queens of France whom the Revolution had sought to erase. The reburial marked the official, state-sanctioned recognition of Marie Antoinette as a martyr of the monarchy. The Queen's physical journey had ended where it began, within the sacred traditions of the French crown. The enduring iconography. 2 centuries later, Marie Antoinette remains one of history's most potent icons. She is not remembered solely as a monarch, but as a cultural figure whose story embodies the eternal tension between celebrity and power, innocence and political malice. Her image, the tower of powdered hair, the simple white muslin dress, and the pale stoic face on the execution cart has transcended the specific politics of the Revolution. She is studied, adapted, and reinterpreted in every generation, starring in countless books, films, and operas. She has become the eternal symbol of the misunderstood woman, the ultimate victim of political propaganda, whose heartbreak, hidden and exposed, ultimately became her legacy. Her story is not just the tragedy of a queen, but a cautionary tale about the fatal intersection of personality, perception, and political reality. The truth of her life is scattered in between the brilliance of the myths she inspired, and it is in that nuanced, heartbreaking space that the queen no one truly knew finally